We're going live right now. We keep working the bugs out. So, guys, anyone who's watching live, please let us know that you can hear us. Text chat on the side there. Um, Thanks for being patrons. Really appreciate it. And I notice I have a few new ones in the last week or so. So I appreciate you guys too. So some of you are watching this live, and some will be watching it later, and some will be listening to the audio version later on. So you can listen in your car and while you work out and so forth. Again, let us know if you can hear us. And hey, DeBronzo. Hey, Henshaw. I'm actually working on the audio for, just so you know, guys, I'm working on the audio edition for the Lake Mungo Patreon podcast from 2 weeks ago with Paul Tremblay and Nadia Wolkin. That was a lot of fun. So they're both crazy about the movie, and so am I. So I should have that tomorrow, if not tomorrow, the next day. So anyway, Laird Barron's here. Hey, Laird.
Hey, Mike. Hey, everybody.
So Laird and I were just catching up. I really don't know how we got on this topic. I don't know if you remember, but we started talking about strange but true things that have happened, that we couldn't explain. And I paraphrased some Carl Sagan, and I said that it's okay to say that you don't know when weird things happen. And so you started telling me a couple of stories. I mean, I've got one or two, but it seemed like you had, I don't know, half a dozen or so. You told me two of them. And, like I said in my post, the sun, it's like 2:00 in the afternoon, sun shining through the window, and my blood's running cold with these stories that you're telling. So thanks for agreeing to tell them to the patrons. So, yeah.
Well, to preface this, you just sent me a link to Sagan.
Yeah.
The basically the documentary he did years ago, and I have to say it's really apropos, and my mind, I kind of go to the same place he does. I am absolutely fascinated with cryptozoology, UFOlogy, the occult. I am pretty open-minded about the possibility of all kinds of things that we don't see in the everyday being, more, there's more to them than we might readily acknowledge. At the same time, even though I've had a lot of things happen to me in my life, I remain a skeptic, only in the sense that I'm very comfortable in not labeling things. I see something, experience something that's inexplicable. I have a tendency to wish to rule out all the other more rational possibilities before I leap to the conclusion that what I saw truly was inexplicable. And so, yeah, I have a handful of things that have happened to me over the years that I'd be happy to share them with you guys in the spirit of campfire tales. I don't
exactly.
I would like to just disclaimer is, I don't put even if I fall kind of into the trap of, that was a really weird thing, I honestly don't wish to put labels on them. I just want to share them with you. And there are many possible explanations for these things, but they're fun stories. And I certainly love hearing them from my fellow authors and people that I grew up with. Over the years, that was a pretty big thing in Alaska. A lot of tales being, of experiences in the wilderness and stuff being passed around. So
it's this sense that the world is quite possibly, there's far more to it than you can understand, even though you don't know that for sure. And I'm right there with you with this absolute fascination with the paranormal, but at the same time tempered by skepticism.
Right.
The quote that I sent Laird is from Cosmos, the very beginning. Such an inspiring series, but I'll just read this quote. We wish to find the truth no matter where it lies. But to find the truth, we need imagination and skepticism both. We will not be afraid to speculate, but we will be careful to distinguish speculation from fact. So, yeah, That's how I feel about it as well.
Right. I think that's a brilliant quote, and I think it's really appropriate. Uh, like I said, I have, some people are kind of nervous about sharing experiences, but I think what people really are nervous about is, they have a certain belief, and then it may run counter to what the average person believes. And I'm just wide open. I have
Hmm.
absolutely no, I've seen what I've seen, and kind of like a corollary to that whole thing, or an addendum, is I actually think it doesn't have to be, something strange happens, right? And by strange, I mean, it's just something that's atypical, something that you don't have a ready explanation for. Yet, for me to be fascinated, for it to trigger something in me to want to investigate further, or to be mystified, or in awe, it actually doesn't have to, it wouldn't even have to have an occult explanation. In other words,
Right.
the rational explanation can rival the irrational. That's something I feel like when I'm writing horror, is that I do love to put the irrational in there. I think most horror writers do, to some degree, but the rational is often, in other words, the whole idea that truth is stranger than fiction. Some of the things that have happened to me, the rational explanations were actually more nerve wracking in their potentiality than, oh, it was a poltergeist, or it was a UFO, I was a ET or
Yeah,
something.
one of the stories that you told me, which I won't tell, I'll let you tell, but it at the end of the story, we were both talking about that if it was a, I don't want to use the word mundane, but rational explanation, that it was just as scary, if not more scary, than a paranormal explanation.
Absolutely. And so that's, another way of looking at this whole thing, is that any of these stories that we are going to talk about could have an absolutely mundane explanation, or a rational explanation, but that rational explanation is nonetheless counter to everyday experience, and kind of spooky in its own its own right. So no, like I said, I love to talk about this stuff. It informs my writing. I very seldom I haven't really incorporated much of it in my writing, but it certainly informs it. So I think maybe it's of interest to people who follow my work, to, maybe just hear kind of like behind the curtain of things that happened over the years that have had an impact on me.
Oh yeah, no doubt, no doubt. Where do you want to start?
Well, let me just set the stage. I'm broadcasting from upstate. Well, it's not quite upstate New York. We're right on the edge. We're in the upper mid Hudson Valley, about 2.5 hours north of New York City. I'm out in the country. It's not quite the wilderness, but I can look out one window to the east and see the Catskills. They're about 10 miles away. There are farms. It's like this little, kind of a Norman Rockwell sort of neighborhood, a few minutes away from a hamlet of a couple thousand people. It's a bedroom community, but you drive through it in about a minute and a half.
Mhm.
And then just north of me is Kingston, which is a decent sized town, 20-30,000 people. So it's very much rural, without being isolated. But at night, there's only one or two lights outside. So I've got wilderness on the property. It's 4 acres. And so it's a neat place to write. I'm sitting here typing at 2 a.m, and I can hear the coyotes some nights screaming out there. So it's kind of like the best of both worlds. It's been a great place to write, but it also, when it gets dark, it reminds you, you're just on the edge of wilderness, because only just a few miles away, it's, you've got the mountains and big forests and stuff. So I love it. I love it here. So that's where I'm kind of broadcasting from. We've had huge electrical storms the last 24 hours, and I say that also to warn everybody, if I vanish suddenly, it wasn't occult forces. The power got knocked out for about the 15th time. It has literally
This
gone
is
out.
this is not host two, so yeah.
No, it is. Well, you never know, right? That's the famous last words. But the power's been knocked out off and on for hours, off and on
Okay.
for the last 12, 14 hours. So anyway, but I was raised in Alaska in the 70s. I was born in 1970. So even before we moved into the wilderness, and that's the bona fide, wilderness, when I was about 9, 10 years old, we still lived in what would be, I think most people would consider, extremely rural. It was much more rural even than where I'm living now. And you know, I wrote an essay about this, or several essays actually, but I grew up during the Satanic Panic. Um, we played D&D when I was a kid, and that was all tied into that. And I have to say, I've never conducted an actual research into it, but it seems that the fascination with cryptozoology it's still alive and vibrant. But back when I was a kid, it was a little more mainstream for a few years there in the 70s and early 80s, as was the occult, people being worried about Satanism and cults lurking in your neighborhood and stuff like that. And it went right hand in hand with the terror, and I am not exaggerating, but this actual terror that people had, especially in Alaska, of nuclear holocaust, with Russia being, as Sarah Palin would famously say, we could see them from our doorstep, but we couldn't, but we definitely felt their presence, and we were very worried because we have Fort Richardson and Elmendorf Air Force Base there, and it was obviously everyone was paranoid that Alaska would get hit, but they were also paranoid that we were going to be infiltrated by deep cover moles, which of course the Americans, the TV show just a few years ago, really captured that, that paranoia and said, oh, but you were right. This is what we were doing. So all this stuff seemed to kind of go hand in hand. But when I was growing up, whether it was sort of, kind of the odd character lurking at the edge of the village who had some stories, or whether it was the pastor or the freight, I won't want to call him a captain, but there was a ex merchant marine who used to travel up and down the Yentna River where we lived when we were out in the woods, who would bring supplies. And he had in the summertime, he drove this huge freight boat, almost like a huge tugboat, but it was this barge. And he was just as buttoned down, just easygoing guy, didn't say too much. And we got to know him over the years. In the wintertime, he used these huge snowmobiles to haul freight. And he would stop by your house and you'd give him some money and he'd bring your supplies to you. And he had stories because he lived by himself in a cabin up in way farther up in the hills than we did. And so this kind of stuff was really common. People talked about sightings. And so I don't really want to put a label on any of that. I don't know if it was because there's an entertainment factor to it, or people are more paranoid because of the lifestyle. Our community psychology was different back then, but it was a fact that people just would nonchalantly share stories. And I will say that very seldom, though, did they put, I keep using the word label, but they didn't really label it. They would just say, hey, this weird thing happened. What do you make of that? And they were like, ah. So yeah, for me, I would divide it. And I know, we have limited time. I go on for a long time about it, but there are some things that happened to me when I was a kid or to my family. And then there were things that happened to me as an adult, like when I moved to the West Coast, which strangely enough, weirder things by and large have happened to me since I left Alaska than ever happened in Alaska. There were some striking things in Alaska, but I would say on the scale of like things that personally creeped me out or made me feel nervous in some physical way, manifested in Seattle and Olympia. More so
correct
than
me if I'm wrong, but I think the two stories that you've told me so far were not set in Alaska.
No, like I said, in Alaska, I traveled about 40,000 miles in the back of a dog team. And it's just like what, for people who don't understand how it works, it's just like you see, you read Jack London, or you watch you watch an old film where they're out there mushing. They call it mushing huskies. Yeah, you have a sled, and you have a team of anywhere from a handful of dogs to a bunch of dogs, and you head off out into the wilderness. And sometimes you make your own trail with snowshoes and lead the team. Other times, snowmobiles are very popular up there. And so we lived on a waterway. It's called the Yentna River, big river. You can look it up. And deep snow, it's in places it's 20, 30 feet deep, but once it freezes up, it becomes a highway. And what it is that there were little communities. Like we lived for many years, our nearest neighbor was 20 miles away, and you would have to walk, take a barge in the summertime, or a dog team or a snowmobile in the winter. So we were absolutely isolated. And then for a few years, we had a neighbor who was about 2 miles away. So that was our closest neighbor. A lodge came in, a lodge owner came in. So we were really...
Let me set this mood one more. I want to know, because I know in some parts of Alaska, it's, because of the position where it is on the earth, night lasts for months and then day lasts for months. Were you in those sorts of areas?
Not as extreme as 30, pardon me, not quite as extreme as 30 Days of Night, where at a certain point of
Just had
year,
to say that.
yeah, it's not, well, that's about, I think that's probably like one of the only movies ever set like in Barrow, but that's really extreme. Where I lived, and I did live in the mountains at one point, where because we were down in a valley, up in the mountains, but down in a valley, that it was really extreme, the
Yeah.
day and night cycles. But I don't really count that, although there's some
Yeah.
weird stuff happened there. The basis for 30, which became They Remain, and maybe I will tell that story, because that's maybe I'll just tell the ones that are sort of pertinent to some things I've written. But long story short is, where we were living for years on the Yentna River, if you find Anchorage on the map, it was a little bit south of Anchorage, in the countryside, and it's flat. You can see Mount Denali, some people call it Mount Rainier, but it was pretty flat. It's basically forest and swamps and bogs and lots of creeks, like almost impassable terrain, in the sense of you're not just going to go walking. You would have to literally chainsaw your way through it, or machete your way through it. But yeah, it was very isolated for a long time. And like I said, I've traveled thousands and thousands of miles on the dog team. I've raced the Iditarod, which is 1,200 miles 3 times, and all those, and at night, like, a matter of fact, I often ran at night, because the sun comes up about 9 or 10 in the morning, and it goes down at 4 in the afternoon, and it's pitch black by 5. So you get your 6 hours of daylight, which would be about the most extreme. And so I'm out there in the dark, and I've run into all kinds of wild animals, and I've run into some very creepy people. People used to say, well, you carry a rifle, or a pistol. That was for the animals. And I was like, well, yeah, occasionally, because a moose might want to stomp you and your team. You might have to defend yourself, but I carried it just as much, protect myself against potential human predators, anything else. A lot of bad things. Alaska is sort of like, I don't know what it's like these days, but during the 80s, 70s and 80s, it was the murder, violent assault capital of the United States per capita. It was outrageous how many, what the percentages are, and that'd be another whole show talking about that. I've written about that, but it's
So a lot of at that time, a lot of strange people there.
yeah.
Isolated.
And so you were, you know what, and going armed wasn't necessarily, lots of people who went armed met their fate. But the point is, I was much more worried about potential human interaction than I was wild animals. But
Right.
in all that time, as far as seeing something weird, inexplicable, only on 1 or 2 occasions that I personally ever see anything odd. I've had some really weird feelings, which I do not discount. But my family as a whole, my extended family, encountered quite a few things, and relatives or friends of ours encountered things. But I'll tell you one that happened to my father.
Okay.
He's had 2, and this just sort of said it. It's not me, but it was. I know my dad. My dad and I are, we're not on good terms. But my father, I will say this: he's a brave, tough, very single-minded guy. And part of the reason we moved into the woods is because that's how he was raised. Both sides of my family came to Alaska in the early 50s, and it was rugged, very rugged back then. The 2 biggest towns, Alaska, are Anchorage and Fairbanks, which are about 300 miles apart, 350 miles. It was a dirt road. The highway was a freaking dirt road that was oiled and sometimes not oiled to keep the dust down. So everybody living out there, in the little communities, maybe you were living in a native village that had no roads linking to it, or you were in like a satellite town of Anchorage or Palmer or something. But it was really rugged, and not a lot of people had television. They had radios, and things like that in the 50s. And yeah, just very, very creepy stuff. But my father, he encountered, they moved into this, they built a cabin on a hill, and the hill was actually an abandoned bear den. So it was a hollow hill. And I remember going over there in the 70s, and if you can imagine this, a big log cabin, but big, it's like the size of a regular house.
Mhm.
And the lower is like a section, is like half daylight basement, half real basement, like a bunker. And so part of the basement was sticking out, so you could see, it's concrete blocks and stuff like that, and you could see the lake. They had this little, like a tiny lake out back. But if you go further, they never finished the complete interior of the house. And so the house would be like, there's like bunk style for, because there was a bunch of kids. It was back in the days of really big families. And there were probably 12, 14 people living there, at any given time. And this is my grandfather's place. And I remember, and I wrote about this in some of my Jessica May stories. The idea that there was this basement that was unfinished. I remember my dad, when his bed was like from his teens, it was a top of a bunk, right? But behind the bunk there was like a shelf, and behind that shelf, like goes into the wall, was an unfinished. It was just dirt. So like you had concrete blocks coming up to right about where your head would be with your pillow, and then it goes into blackness. It just would go straight a tunnel into darkness, and it was just unfinished.
Nice.
Yeah, and like literally roots and stuff sticking out, and a little draft coming through there. And I slept over a few times. I never liked that. So there goes, something right there. It's probably worth the whole price of admission if you think about it. But it's nothing supernatural. It's nothing occult.
Well,
But
and if you're a
people,
kid, that's certainly going to disturb your sleep a bit.
it's creepy. And I actually lived, and then later on, after everybody left, over the years, everybody migrated. So the house is sitting up on the hill. I actually stayed there for a short period of time when I was 20 because I was estranged from my family and nobody was using the property. So I just basically set up shop there for a winter. And my grandfather, before he died, and well, he left the property and then he passed away. Possibly eaten by a grizzly bear. They're not really sure if the bear killed him or if he had a heart attack, but he had a pretty sensational end. But he had decided that he was going to repair trailer houses. So imagine this: forest all around, a huge clearing. There's a hill, and then there's this like sort of open area where you would have outbuildings. Oh, there was these old metal Quonset hut sheds that the wind kind of creaks through, and it's really creepy because there's nobody there, but it's always like groaning and moaning. But he had all these trailer houses. He was going to repair burned trailer houses. So we at one time there was probably about 20 trailer houses, there's rows of them on this rural piece of property. And they're the kind of things where you go up in them and the roof is gone on some of them. There's just piles of ash, baby dolls, just people's lives like completely melted and slagged. I cannot even begin to tell you how creepy that is to be. My dad one time had spent the night there. He had gone into town. This is back when we were living in the wilderness. He had gone into town and decided that he couldn't make it back that evening. So he parked his truck there on the hill overlooking it and just slept in the truck with his dog. He said, I had to leave. He goes, and this is my dad, tough guy. He goes, yeah, I was there for about 4 or 5 hours. And about 1 a.m, he goes, I just couldn't. He goes, the dog kept growling and looking out the windows. He goes, I just, the wind, he stepped outside, he's listening to the wind kind of through all those trailer houses. And he said, yeah, no. He went and I think he just went to the landing because we had to
I can
have a
see
boat
that
landing.
baby dolls laying around.
Yeah.
Oh
So,
my God.
so this is all pretty mundane, but it's nonetheless, it is kind of, I lived there for a few months and it was extraordinarily creepy. And, actually, I lived there off and on a few points in my life because we were very migratory. We left civilization and moved to this cabin out in the wilderness. But because my dad was training sled dogs and because the area that we lived in is sort of a warmer part of Alaska. I mean, I should say more temperate. You get your 40, 50 below, but there's also winters where the rivers don't freeze very well, that kind of thing. And so we would travel wherever the snow was so we could get the dogs because the dogs we didn't have any way to cart train them. So like we couldn't hook them up to wheeled vehicles and train them in the summer or the fall, or if the weather was not conducive. So we had to actually literally go someplace where there was snow so we could put the 50, 100 miles a day on them that we required. So we actually did live at that home. My dad would call it the homestead, the place where they moved in the 50s. And other people, caretakers had lived there. It was a big piece of property. At one time, it was like 400 acres. And then they slowly but surely sold it off. But it is sort of the genesis for some of the creepiness in some of my stories because I've lived there alone. I lived there with my family. And then a couple times we stayed. And when I say live there, it was like for a few months here, a few months there. And one time we lived there with like a boyfriend of one of my aunts, and my aunt broke up with him, but when we traveled up into the mountains for one winter to do some training, the guy traveled with us, and that turned into 30. And the reason that turned into 30 is so we moved up into kind of toward Glen Allen. If you look on the map, if you go north from Anchorage, there's a town like you're heading into Canada. There's a town called Glen Allen, and it's part of the Copper. It's called the Copper Basin, and it's extremely mountainous, but lower mountains mostly. You can get up into them, but definitely bitter cold. Like the winter comes early. It's extremely cold, and we went up on an old mining road, and the mining road went for about 7 or 8 miles. First of all, you're in the wilderness in the first place. You're on a highway that just goes out in the middle of nowhere. Then you park in a parking lot and you take horses, or if you have big like half track type vehicle, you go for about 7 miles up over a mountain. And then there's these mining communities up there. And some of these mining communities are 100 years, or at the time were 100 years old. They're old placer mining communities and other types of gold mining. And it's kind of hard to describe it, but there aren't very many trees except when you go down in the valley. But so up top, you're literally right at the top where these low mountains, you can look up and you can see the top of the mountain, like literally, it's a mile away basically.
The mining towns, they were abandoned.
Yeah,
no?
they're the kind that you see in coffee table books where the wind's just blowing through this abandoned town. But I say abandoned loosely because sometimes there would be a small handful of people still working there. And long story short is there was a family living. We lived there for about 9 months. And so you get to the top of this ridge. And it's, like I said, it's way up near the very top of these mountains. You're literally it's snow all, you are within a stone's throw of it's snow year round. But then you drop down to this little valley that we were living in, where actual trees, and there was a creek and that kind of thing. And it was very like what you might imagine in Colorado or something, just fast whitewater creek. And this guy, his name is Ted. I'll just change his name, but old Ted was staying with us. And we set up this rudimentary camp. This is how my teens were. We lived half the time. We lived in a plastic, like visqueen. Have you ever heard of that? But it's a plastic, thick, kind of translucent material. My dad just put up platforms and then strung up this plastic, and that's what we lived in 40 below, that winter. And so this guy had a falling out with my dad. And so instead of going back to town, which would have been like about an 8-hour trip to get to basic, by horseback and then by truck, it would have been 6 to 8 hours to get to any kind of civilization. He just decided to kind of make his own way. He was staying in like this little hunting shack about 2 miles from us. And I'm just a kid. I didn't think anything more of it. But one thing I noticed about this area is that there was lots of wildlife, right? There was these squirrels and there were moose and caribou and things like that, fish, but we never found partial skeletons. I remember the first time I ever found a squirrel skeleton there. And these squirrels were these big, like huge red squirrels. They were enormous. And I found one of their skeletons just hanging from the branches in a tree, whole skeleton. It was like somebody just strung it up like a Christmas decoration.
And we started. Hey, wait a minute, hanging from the branches in a tree.
Like just nice. Like it had died in the branches, decomposed. Nothing ate it. Nothing scattered the bones. It was just the wind hadn't dislodged it. It was just hanging there. And we started finding that all over the area. Usually in the bushes, not usually in the trees, but like you would find whole skeletons of birds and squirrels in the bushes. And around here, in New York State, which is wooded, I find bones all the time. A bone, a couple bones, pieces of bones. Everywhere else in Alaska I ever lived, you find pieces. It's not unusual to find a skeleton, but you never find one unless it's a huge animal.
But this particular area, you're saying there was a lot of skeletons hanging from trees and so forth.
More from the bushes, but yes, on a couple occasions from the lower branches of trees.
Something different is going on.
Yeah, and there were no mosquitoes. That was the other thing that blew us away, is that we didn't have any problems with flies or mosquitoes, really. There was very little bug life. And we had a couple visitors. One of them was an Air Force guy. He was an officer in the Air Force and a hunter and all this. And like I said, you had to hike. It was, unless you had a three-wheeler or something like that, we didn't. You would just do the 7-mile hike to our 8-mile hike to our house if you wanted to. And like I said, uphill most of it. and then across this barren stretch. Long story short is that guy on a couple of occasions said, "Man, I don't like this place." He thought I told my dad. He said, "I don't like this place," and my dad was, "What is it?" And he goes, when you break up over the crown and you go about a mile on flat land up on the kind of like a pass, and it goes north and south into the deeper into the mountains, and then we just lived in down lower in this little valley. He said, "I just don't like it." And the only cover in that area were like berry bushes and low alders. Like on the ridge, the tallest bush or tree would be like 6 or 8 feet tall. So there was plenty of cover, but there wasn't like big cover. There weren't any trees.
Right.
And also the ground is always deceiving. You think it's flat, but I mean, I'm sure anybody's lived anywhere in the United States where there's big territory can tell you that nothing's ever truly flat. You go 100 yards, there's a ditch. You go another, but from the distance, it looks like one surface. But no, there's a gully, there's a ravine, there's a 50-foot drop that you can't see. And that's kind of how that was. But when he would drop down into where our camp was, it was literally, this beautiful, isolated, and these old, like huge spruce trees. Long story short is he didn't like it. And the reason he didn't like it, he said, I feel watched. He goes, when I'm walking across, he goes, I really feel like somebody's looking at me through a rifle scope.
And this is an Army guy.
Air Force guy.
Air Force.
Now,
okay.
Now, let me do a quick digression here. One of the reasons that I take, to some degree, I don't always think it means something. You may not be in a position to ever define what it means, but I do take seriously the sensation of being watched. And the reason that I do is for two reasons. One is personal experience. On many occasions, living in the city, I would feel this uncomfortable, like somebody's watching me, and turn, and sure enough, 2 lanes over, somebody's leaning over their steering wheel, just glaring. And so, and I've also evaded a couple muggings. I felt somebody was watching me, and sure enough, they were standing behind a telephone pole and they were coming up on me. The second reason that I place some emphasis on it, or belief in it, is that in World War II, there was research done to corroborate the idea that sentries, if they were stared at long enough with no other stimuli, would sooner or later realize that they were being watched. They conducted these sentry silent removal techniques, where you sneak up behind a sentry. G.I. Joe would sneak up and slice their throat, and they would test it with their own people. You have a couple guys sitting there guarding something, and then you would send in someone to get them. And what they found is very often, if you stared at them long enough, they would start looking around. And there's some kind of weird phenomenon that animals, the same thing. Hunters will tell you, if you stare at an animal long enough, it'll look up and start trying to figure out why it feels uncomfortable. So we took it fairly seriously. It didn't, and there were other people living in the area. So what happened next was old Ted, one day, haven't seen him in weeks. It's getting very close to winter. And we had these big hills all around our camp. And the hills there were trees down low and nothing up top, except these thick, like blueberry bushes and things, and brambles and things. The guy shows up in our camp, and my dad was gone at the time doing something. And the guy has his rifle, with a hunting rifle with a scope, and he's just wild-eyed. And this guy was sort of what I would classify as a hippie. He was a real easygoing guy. He was not easygoing on this late afternoon. And he started interrogating me, my brothers, and my mother. And he said, "You guys have been spying on me. You've been, trying to scare me." And over time, he calmed down. My mom made him tea and said, "Just calm down." And basically, he had heard, he was staying in this little hunter's cabin. It was more like a shed. Didn't have windows. It was him and his dog. And he kept hearing chanting, he claimed, in the woods.
Wow.
Now keep in mind, the nearest people living, our nearest neighbors were about 15 miles away, 10 to 15 miles away. And there are lots of little valleys. We're talking about the kind of valleys where anywhere from 1/4 mile wide to 50 feet wide. And you can barely even, the creek's coming down through rocks and underbrush. Like you almost couldn't even follow the creek in places. So sound carries, the wind, these things wind and they snake. So somebody could be talking, you and I could be having this conversation around a campfire. One of our audience might be listening to this 5-10 miles away, like hearing a little weird, like it's a weird acoustic effect of living there. And right. So we convinced him, because we weren't messing with them. We were mischievous kids, but we the guy had a rifle. I mean, we were not stupid. You don't mess around with armed people. So it's a good way to get, to get perforated. So we had nothing to do with him. And he eventually left. My dad took him to town, and he could not handle it. But we said, well, what did it sound like? And he said, like in a horror movie. And we were, to be honest, we were kind of like, this guy's, he's been eating the mushrooms or something, because he said it was like Gregorian chanting, and it was just like in call and response kind of stuff. Like you could hear someone calling out something, and then there's a crowd, and we didn't buy it. We did not buy it. So long story short, is we eventually moved. It was just the winter was too brutal. We left. About 2 years later, my father is in a hardware store, and this young man starts talking to him, and he goes, "Oh, you're John, John Barron. And I'm Fred. You remember you used to live next door to my, next door to my father." And we're like, "Oh yeah, way back in the day, we had lived next door to this guy." And he says, "Yeah, we're all really upset because my sister and her boyfriend have been taken over. Basically they disappeared, or not disappeared, but had been co-opted by a cult." And he says, "Yeah, there's this cult, and they're like quasi-Christian, but we don't think they're really Christian, and blah blah blah. And they basically take people up into the mountains and make them kind of slave labor." And it turned out it was those people who lived just a few miles from us, this mining community. And that was their gig. They had weird ceremonies, and or I shouldn't say weird, but they had these ceremonies. There was different indication that it was anything sensational, but we just went, oh, because there was, from what this guy said, there was animal sacrifice, like Old Testament style burnt offerings and things like that. So we all just looked at each other and said, oh, that area, because we had always talked about it in the 2 years, that had passed. We just said that was a creepy area. And that just added.
I guess Ted wasn't bullshitting us. Yeah.
No, I don't think he was. I think he heard them having their outdoor ceremonies. And like I said, I don't know that there was anything sinister about them. Although, the fact that they would basically do a Mooney. I had a friend who was all, sort of kidnapped by the Moonies, or associate who was kidnapped by the Moonies when he was, kind of jettisoned out of the army for mental problems back in the 80s. And it's very similar. They pick you up at an airport or a bus station and say, "Oh, you look hungry. Are you, come on." And it's this whole gig of, look, we're a mining community, or we fish, or what, we're farmers. And then you find out that it's, oh no, we have this stuff for you to read. And how about the guys all stay in this dorm, and the ladies all stay in that?
Oh yeah, very friendly at first, and it works very well on people who are lost in a way.
Oh yeah, and mentally. That's right. And like I said, my associate, he should never have been in the military in the first place, and he essentially got a Section 8, and he was just prime for them to haul away, and he managed to get out of it. But the point is, so I don't know that there's anything sinister, but how sinister does it have to be? They're manipulating people. So that's
yeah. I mean, imagine Ted, and I'm sure you have, and to the audience, imagine being this Ted guy. You're out in the middle of nowhere in this shack, right?
Yeah,
and
it's not even a shack. It's like a lawnmower shed, out in the middle of nowhere. Oh,
and it's pitch dark outside. I mean, it's not like the movies where there's a light shining through the woods or anything.
No.
And you hear this chanting. I mean, who would not be creeped out?
Well, and there's a fast running stream over, it's the kind of thing you see a river runs through it, where they're fly fishing. It's this semi whitewater stream nearby. And so the sound is all messed up anyway. And the kicker to that story and how it so all that sort of led to some of the atmosphere in 30. It wasn't the genesis for the story, but it was certainly details from my childhood. Like, oh, I can, that was creepy. The creepy part was, and I talked about it in the story, is that he admitted to watching us for about 3 hours through the rifle scope. He had been watching us go about our daily chores, and he told my mom, he goes, "Oh, our lights are flickering." He told my mom, "I would have shot you if I thought you guys had done it." I mean, he admitted that he had contemplated shooting us.
Wow.
So just not apologetic and not threatening. It was just, yeah, I just wanted to verify. I don't think he spied on us for a better part of a day to see if we were up to anything weird. I don't know in his mind what that would have proved, but the point is that maybe it's funny. It's telling though about the attitude that we had when I was growing up that I almost forgot to mention that part of the story.
Yeah.
That's I literally would have thought of it after the show and went, oh yeah, I should have mentioned, because that didn't even it bothered us, but not in the way that a contemporary person, contemporary family would be totally peeing themselves. We were just like, well, I think that we need to encourage him to get on a bus. We don't need a guy with a rifle, you know, scoping us. And so my dad, said, hey, let's go. And the guy thankfully was willing to get the hell out of Dodge. He had had enough. It was about 3 or 4 months into his stay. And I think he had gotten cabin fever, because he wasn't from Alaska. He had only been living in Alaska for a couple of years. So this was it's tough on people who know what to expect, but I think it's really tough on people who transplant. So there you go. There's a creepy story with a tie-in to to my work.
You've mentioned two things about Alaska before you go on that have really fascinated me, and I may paraphrase them badly, but not just Alaska, but the first thing was, you've mentioned being in a cabin several times, writing. I don't know that was in Alaska, and you felt the atmosphere of the outdoors. Speaking of paraphrasing badly, start to
Right.
close in on you.
Yeah,
Um,
that's a really good one. That's a good point. And actually, once again, ties into not my writing, but it ties into my relationships with writers over here on the East Coast. So back in 2011, I left Washington State, and it was just me and my dog and a few belongings in my truck. And I was staying with my brother. Now, my brother, this is in Western Montana. Once again, look at a map. It's kind of like between Missoula. It's Lincoln. You can find Lincoln on the map. And it's this little town. And I say town, but it's really just a few buildings on a stretch of highway in the middle of nowhere. Well, my brother lived about 10 miles as the eagle flies, 10 or 12 miles north of that, up in the mountains. And they're low mountains. They're like the Catskills, I would say, maybe a tiny bit bigger. So we're not talking about huge white cat peaks all year round right there, but definitely, when winter comes, it's cold and 4 foot of snow and all that kind of thing. And
right.
so I stayed with them for a while, and where they lived was at the end of this logging road. So you can drive up, it's paved for part of it. Then it's dirt for a few miles, and then it narrows down to like 1 lane dirt road. And then there was like a little, and then there's all these little logging trails that 1 lane logging trails that go off into the mountains. And these mountains go for it literally into remote parts of Canada. There you go. See ya. You could have walked out my brother's back door and been walking for weeks or months and not seen anybody. So his house was sitting up on a hill, and there was a road going up to it, but it was like an old mining trail, or logging trail, I should say. And once the wintertime came, it was either dog team or skiing or snowmobile. There was no driving there. And I was there in the spring, like April, like 1st of April, until the 3rd week of October is when I came over here. And my brother's property he had like a big, almost like a Viking longhouse. It was this big one room. The main structure was one room, fairly skinny, fairly long, very nice. And then there was like a bedroom, a bathroom, a few things. And the way and then he had lots of outbuildings. He had bought it. He purchased it from somebody else. It had been built like 40 years prior. So it was literally like sort of a modernized cabin. It was almost just a cabin in the woods, family sized. And there was no electricity. We had a phone line. The funny thing is we did have a phone line that literally they paid somebody like $3,000 to run it from the telephone poles that were about 2 miles away. And they literally, the coax cable, they literally snaked that through the bushes, dug a little trench across his driveway so it didn't get run over. And then you could follow that cable all the way to a telephone pole a couple miles away. That was what they had. I laughed my ass off when I was like, that is all. How'd you get somebody to do that? He goes, just this guy did it for us. No biggie. So they had a phone, but they didn't have electricity. And the way that we had electricity is they used a generator, and they had a big Caterpillar, like a bulldozer batteries. And so we had power, but also you would turn it off and it was dark. So anyhow, at some point, my brother decided, my sister-in-law was pregnant and getting ready to give birth. So they moved into Helena, which is a big pretty big town. And they said, can you stay? I wasn't quite ready to, I was writing the Croning, as a matter of fact. I was right in the middle of the Croning. And so that's what I was doing every day. I would get up, my dog would go running around, Athena would go running around, and then I would write for a few hours, then I go for another walk. Grizzly Adams. I think I even did a live journal post that this is like Grizzly Adams territory. It was just absolutely beautiful. You could see a bear running, down the road in front of you, a hawk circling both of you, that kind of thing.
Right.
Salmon, trout jumping in the streams. I mean, it really is a beautiful place. But they move. They said, can you stay here for a few days by yourself? Because what the plan was, I was going to move down in town with them for a couple of weeks. Athena needed an operation. And so I was going to stay with them, have her operated on, and then do this 2,300-mile drive to the East Coast. And also they had a cat. The cat was an indoor-outdoor cat, and the cat ran off for days at a time, and the cat had taken off. I said, I'm not leaving until the cat comes back anyway. I'm not leaving her. She's not going to come here and find we're all, because they were leaving forever. And so they're like, hey, great. And so it was just me, a couple of their dogs, their old retired dogs, and a horse. And they had moved everything else. And they were going to come back every few days and keep moving their property. And I remember telling John Langan, that was when Google Hangouts first started. So I was able to pop the generator, get my little laptop going, and have this really weird, broken, creepy connection with, like horror movies, the horror movie style connection, like, yeah, So anyway, I was telling
Laird,
him,
look behind you. Look behind you.
I was telling him, I stayed in an attached, like a little bunkhouse kind of a thing, like a really tiny space. And I didn't have any appliance or anything. So like the bathrooms inside and the running water and all that. And so I would go inside a few times a day, boil my tea, do whatever, take a shower, whatever. But they were gone. And I still, they say, hey, if you want to stay in the house, you can. I'm like, no, we're comfortable out here. But I would go there to plug into the internet and call John and to make lunch and things like that. And so I can't remember what order this happened in. I can't remember which happened, but two things happened. Well, three things. The first thing is I noticed that the place, as you alluded to, the wilderness just immediately started moving in. Within 24 hours of them being gone, that place, the character of that place went from few dogs. So they had like 4 old retired dogs and a couple, they had a Karelian bear dog and, a cat and all this, the kids, they had 3 kids running around, and the character just changed. I have lived by myself for years at a stretch in far more remote locations. I didn't have phone or internet or anything, nothing, even lights, just had kerosene lamp, things like that. And never was worried about anything. I won't say I was worried there, but it gave me a little bit of pause. I'm looking around going, this place is, it almost feels like there's a Barbara Roden story called Northwest Passage. And it's about how we don't belong. Like there are times where you realize with your little cabin that there's like something out there that just wants to just flatten it and return it to the earth, that you are, the corpuscles are coming out you're an infection, and nature's antibodies are now being generated, and they're going to take the form of who knows what to flush you out of the system because you are an invader. You are a toxin. And I kind of got that in Alaska quite a few times. And I definitely got it while I was sitting there. So 2 things happened. Once I went in there in the middle of the night to make some tea, and this is mid-September. So it's chilly at night, but it's summer. I left the door open and I walk in and I'm making the tea, and I was using a headlamp because it was just too much of a hassle to get the power going in the house. And Athena was sitting with me. And so I'm over their stove, and it's a gas flame stove, just thinking my thoughts. I was writing the Croning, or maybe I was doing something else. And I wasn't really in any kind of weird frame of mind, but all of a sudden I just got this odd feeling, and Athena started growling. And for people who don't know her, I used to post about her a lot. She's about an 80-pound pit bull, brave, just this brave, tough dog. And this was not her normal bark. This wasn't her. This was like that. The chills, because I recognized that's a bear. That was her first time she met a bear. She peed, and she climbed on top of me and peed some more, and she growled, and she sat on my chest, and her teeth out. This was her angry, terrified, not upset, not displeased. This was her savage side. And I look up and I'm like, I'm not understanding. I'm looking around the cabin, right? And the end of the cabin where their bedroom was about 40 feet away, 30 feet away. It's like I said, it's a fairly long place. And I realized that what the problem was is that the bedroom door was open. Now that doesn't sound odd, right? The problem is
Mm.
that the house was out of plumb. It was very old, and so like you could literally take a ball, and you wouldn't notice it by eye, but if you just drop the ball on the floor, it would roll from one end of the house to the other. So the door would naturally swing open, and I had shut the. Oh, actually, I think this was the second thing that happened because I had shut the door a day before, and it's shut. It's firmly shut. It was open, and she's growling at it, and I did not like that. The odds. I mean, somebody could have easily crept into the house, but I shouldn't say easily. I'm not sure how they would have. I was living attached to the house. It would have been very weird for her, for the two dogs that were living they were in a huge enclosure right beside the house. One of the dogs, theirs or mine, would have smelled or heard somebody. So I went up there and checked, nothing, but I definitely didn't like the feeling. Uh, Nothing came of that. But what had happened prior to that, now that I'm thinking about it, is I was sitting in the living room a day or two prior and I was talking to John on Google Hangouts. And I was sitting in a swivel chair, and Athena, once again, she didn't growl, but she just had her head up and she was staring behind me toward the bedroom. And I turned, and I kid you not, this door was wide open. It has to go uphill to shut. Keep that in mind. You would literally, there's no, the reason, part of the reason it's open is because it's out of plumb downhill. I'm watching it close. I watched it go.
Jesus.
It went all the way up, and it closed. And I don't know if John remembers or not, but if you ever have him, you should ask him and say, because I said something. I said, "You won't believe what I'm seeing, John." And he's like, "Well, what is it?" I said, I'm going to have to go. I said, but, and I didn't think anybody was in the house because I could see well enough when it started. I didn't see anybody. They would have had to have a string maybe to pull it. There was nobody. From where I was sitting, I would have seen someone pulling the door. No, it was really slow. Like it was like half speed, like at half of what you would shut it.
Yeah.
Almost, almost sneaky. And it shut. And I walked up, and I remember I opened it and I walked around there and looked. And so after that, I kept it shut. But then, at least on one occasion that I recall, I walked in and it was open again. And you know, back to where we started, I don't know what to make of that. Did somebody do it? Sure. Was I somehow wrong about the physics of it? I possibly, but it was
But in order for this
definitely
door to shut, it was at a slant that went uphill,
right.
so to
Like,
speak.
yeah, it
So
significant.
it can't shut on its own.
Not right. And there was no
Yeah.
breeze. There was, because the thing is, doors open and shut with vacuum. You can
Right,
open a
right.
door in one part and slamming. You know, I fully understand all that.
But unless it's latched, gravity keeps that door open.
Right.
Yeah.
And the dog was really unhappy. And apropos to John, since we're talking about John and I actually did share a weird experience once, although he has a tendency to think it was, he just sort of like, let's not talk about it. But one time when I moved to the East Coast,
You
I
did.
was, oh yeah, when it first happened, he was a little, this one thing that I'm going to describe, he was a little unnerved. But since then, I think it's just, like, I don't know. And you know what? That's fair enough. But one
Yeah.
time when I was staying with them, and they have an older house, it was built long ago, and there's upper story, the main floor, and then there's a basement. And I was staying with them, and I rented a room in the back. And John and I, hanging out all the time. And I remember I was standing in my room, and he's in the kitchen, which is about 25 feet away at the most. And there's like a bathroom, a spare bedroom that was an office, and then and this is like heading into the kitchen. And then there was one of those old 1970s balsa wood style doors, those really thin doors that led down into the basement. And the basement was a steep flight of stairs, big freaking basement. And there was a garage door down there. So you get in and out with a garage door. Nobody lived down there. There was a cat down there. Now maybe this was the cat, but this is, so I don't know if this is weird, but it seemed odd. It was pretty funny. He's doing something in the kitchen. I'm standing, like I said, I can't see him, but I hear this pounding, and it's the pounding on that cellar door. And it's loud. It's like somebody's got the palm of their hand and they're bam, bam, bam a few times. And then rattling. That was the other part. It was rattling. Now, maybe the cat was doing it, because sometimes there was a cat that lived down there because she was kind of scared of the dog. She never did like my dog or his dogs. And every now and then the cat would like mess with the dogs. They'd go by and the cat would stick her paw out from under. It is possible that the cat was doing something to the door, but
I don't know, man. I've got cats and they scratch on the door.
right. Well,
Yeah.
I watched the door handle rattling. So it looked like, and I can't remember if the door was locked or not. I think like there was like a little lock on the outside. I want to say that we kept it so we didn't just accidentally open it up. The kid didn't open it up and the dog go running downstairs. There was one of the dogs staying there that didn't like cats either. And
Just
so
let me get this straight. There's some banging on the door and
yeah,
the doorknob is rattling.
yeah, oh yeah.
Like, is it twisting?
I don't remember if it was twisting, but I remember it was like shaking. Like it looked like it was being rattled.
Yeah, that's pretty odd.
And it was enough that John, spatula in hand, he was making himself some grub. He's standing at one end of the hall, and like I said, maybe 20 feet. It's a narrow hall or a short hall. He's standing there looking at me, and I'm looking at him, and I'm like, are we seeing this? And he's like, yeah, because this went on for a few seconds after we were looking at it. So I immediately went over there and I opened the door, and my thought was that somebody had come in through the downstairs and was messing with us.
Mhm.
No, the cat wasn't there. Now the cat could have jumped off the side of the stair. Who knows? But a person would never. I mean, I went right down. I don't creep along. I just went boom. I went downstairs. And I'm like, I'm gonna,
Better
if
to
there's
know.
somebody there, I'm gonna. Well, yeah, I have a tendency to just feel that way, and so I went and confronted. That door was shut downstairs. So to this day, there's no like that's as weird as it got. Nothing else happened, and that's the only odd thing that ever
Right,
happened.
but
to
it's
me.
unexplainable.
Yeah, I thought it was really unusual because the door wasn't just a little bit of shaking. What got me about it was the impact. It wasn't just like somebody was like pushing the door, which could be a cat hooking pushing it. This was like a broad, fleshy surface striking the door repeatedly, not punching. It sounded for all the world like somebody slapping the door. And there was nobody home. It was just me and John, middle of the day too. Like it was not weird, nothing creepy. And we have no explanation for it. It was just this odd.
And the reason why I wanted you to tell these stories is because there are people out there, and I'm not making fun of them when I say this, but any little thing that happens, they immediately attribute to the paranormal, the unexplainable, whatever, when they haven't even looked for another explanation. And
Right.
They definitely never say, I don't know. But I know you well enough that if something weird happened, it happened. Even though you may not have an explanation for it, and usually we don't.
Well,
Yeah.
I think one of the reasons that I'm super skeptical, despite, like I said, I experienced that, but I'm completely open to, hey, it was this, that, or the other thing.
Mhm.
But this, that, or the other thing, with the exception of the cat, would be pretty unusual. Somebody was hiding down there, whatever. I'm just tossing it out there to say this is this thing that happened. I don't know. It was odd. You don't have it. I think most people would be a little unnerved if their root cellar or their basement door started banging and there's nobody.
Sure.
There's nobody down there. Not supposed to be. But one of the reasons that I became kind of more skeptical, because when I was younger, I was extremely credulous because I believed what my eyes saw uncritically. I saw this. I heard this. I felt this. Somebody told me whom I trust. I had this really weird experience once when I was working as a personal trainer, and I did a workout, and it's called high intensity training. You have to be very careful with it, but it exhausts you. And I didn't feel exhausted. I had done the training, and I actually I had to wear a suit and tie, and I put my clothes back, my nice clothes back on. And I saw something out of the corner of my eye. And keep in mind, this is like a completely sealed off room. There's fluorescent lighting, and there's no outside light. And I saw a rainbow, and I'm there watching this rainbow, vivid, going across the gym wall around a corner. Like it was like an alcove. There's no way for anything other than the overhead lights. I'm watching a multicolored rainbow, and it would like bar by bar appear and then reverse itself. And it did this over and over and it even reflected on the other machines. And so I'm looking at going, how? And I walked around. I was looking for a prism. I was looking for anything I could. Nothing. So as I said, I was pretty credulous back then. I thought I saw something miraculous. So I get to talking to the guy that runs the place, who knows a little bit more about this stuff. He explained to me, he goes, oh, actually what happened is, There's a medical term for what happened. I don't remember what it was, but essentially certain chemicals are released in the brain after that kind of activity that I did. And so even though I didn't feel tired, the chemicals, I was basically having like proprioception. There was this weird, I was basically hallucinating. And that's all it was. And I've looked it up
Right.
since, and it was just like flat out the most realistic hallucinate. I've hallucinated many times for various reasons, and I've always known I was hallucinating. I've even screamed. One time I even screamed, "I'm hallucinating," just to remind myself. When I was a kid, some shit was going down, and it was because I was exhausted. I had not slept in like 3 days, and I was on a race, and yeah, my brain just was like, "That's it. I'm creating
That'll
this
do it.
fantasy world." And yeah, and I knew that was what was going on, and it was very vivid. But I was well aware that it was happening. I was quite rational. I'm looking at it. So what that taught me, especially since I did some research on it afterward, I didn't take his word. He just says, "Here's the literature." He goes, all kinds, bright lights though are associated with this phenomenon. And I went, it brought home to me as in my early 20s. I'm like, you cannot uncritically trust what you see to be literally deep, that is in fact what you saw, because your brain will try to create images. It'll try to create forms so there's no forms. I've
Yeah.
known that from hunting, from sitting in a spot waiting for a moose to come by or something. That bush starts looking like a moose, or it starts looking like a person, and it can look very realistic. And it's because your brain it's dim or dark even, and your brain is trying to make sense of the the insensible.
Yeah. And our brain is trained to look for patterns, find patterns.
Right. And so that's one of the reasons that I'm a skeptic, but not a skeptic in the sense of there is nothing out there, move along. More just, okay, but let's corroborate. In other words,
Right, right. The word skeptic gets a bad rap. What it really
absolutely,
means, what it
yeah,
really means is, you know what? It may be true, but we'll believe it when we have some evidence for it. And if
right,
we don't have the evidence for it, one friend told me that he became really free about this kind of stuff when I told him that. I said, Larry, it's okay to say, I don't know. And he's like,
yes.
that never occurred to me.
Well, you
And
were
it was very
gonna,
freeing.
you were gonna share. I mean, I don't know how much time we have or what, but you were gonna share a story, so maybe you should.
Well, I think all these guys have heard it, but what I was going to say is that the stories that I would like you to share that you told me the other day
Right.
were experienced by more than one person,
Yes.
which gives them more credibility. And then in
Right.
one case, a third person, I don't want to give this story away, like you said, was very disturbed by what he heard.
Right.
But yeah, we were driving down a road at night, middle of the night, 2-lane road, woods on either side. And all of a sudden we saw what looked exactly like a humanoid shadow, but 2-dimensional, standing upright, if you can imagine that. And it ran very quickly from the right of the road to the left and disappeared. And we both looked at each other and we both described the same thing. I don't know what the hell that was, and I'm okay saying I don't know, but it's pretty fucking weird. So it was, and my point is, it was two of us that saw the same thing. I didn't describe, oh, this is what I saw, and then Danielle's imagination, said, oh yeah, that's what I saw too. We kind of more or less said it at the same time.
Right.
So
No,
what
that's
if, yeah. So you're in, I don't remember where, but you're out with your girlfriend, wife at the time, something.
right. My ex-wife, we were together for many years, and we actually had a. It's really interesting because if stuff happens to you like frequently all the time, I think that's a sign. Maybe I would take that for myself as a sign of, okay, you're jumpy.
Yeah.
No, I've gone, like I said, man. I went across Alaska, and my head being filled constantly with, oh, there's Sasquatch, or there's there's some really creepy. Oh, I mean, my dad has a creepy story about being stalked by a group of some things on the ice, and so it was habitually heard these stories, or would be sharing these stories. And like I said, I have a lot of weird, creepy feelings. and I have a lot of anecdotes that other people shared, but I only have like a couple like mild things that happened to me. Yet when I lived in and here in New York, I've only had actually one thing happen at this place. That was it. The rest of the time, so this is years. I've been living in New York for almost 10 years, and I had that incident with John, which two people,
By
and
the
then I
way,
had
speaking of the incident with John, you said
the
the
incident with
words.
John.
Yeah, you you said the words cellar door, which is reportedly the most beautiful phrase in the English language if you watch Donnie Darko. So
And I shouldn't even be using cellar door because it's more of Alaska. It's not a cellar, it's a basement. But the point is that I've lived here for 10 years. I have written more intensely over the last, in other words, I am far more immersed in the occult. We're doing research and writing about it and scaring I try to scare myself so I can scare others. And I've had two things happen, and that inexplicable things. That is it. So I'll go years and nothing will happen. So I have a tendency when things happen around me to pay attention.
right.
And there's something unusual going on, whether it's man-made, manufactured, or whether there's something that would be considered the inexplicable.
Well, the
But
story that I think you're about to tell, whether it's man-made or paranormal, is scary as hell either way.
Well, and there's a couple details I didn't tell you. There's a couple things about this story I'm just going to share with you guys. There's
Sure.
basically 3 or 4 linked events that happened in Seattle. And one of the reasons I have never shared the one is because even though I'm going to just tell you up front, it could have been a hallucination. It's one of those things that you share it, people are like, oh yeah, you may have something, you may be seeing things type of thing. But I'm 51. I'm just at the point where I was like, take it or leave it. I really don't care. I'm just going to just talk about it. So what happened is so I was dating this really wonderful person, and pretty normal. Like, in other words, I was not writing then. It was right before I really got back into writing. And actually this person was one of the reasons that I got back into it. I said, I need to do more with my life than just be doing these random manual labor jobs. And I thought that writing might eventually lead to more security for me. And what a joke. But anyway, so we get to that. That'd be another show, the futility. But anyhow, she was living in, so I had a little house, or excuse me, a little room in a boarding house, which I later found out might have been one of the boarding houses that Ted Bundy was hanging around in when he was stalking women. I was living on the same street. It was Fraternity Row.
Oh,
So it's
nice.
right there it's right off the campus of UW. It was the cheapest place I could find. So I had frats on both sides of this big 3-story just crap building that was just loaded with all kinds of, people like myself, itinerant, creepy people from Alaska and the hinterlands, at loose ends. And then across the way, there were like a couple sorority houses. So it was just chaos. Talk about a slice of humanity. But she lived in this, she was renting the top room in this big house about a mile away. And I remember right before she moved out, she started saying that she just was having these creepy experiences. And we'd been dating for a few months, and we'd never really even talked about any of this stuff that I recall. So it wasn't like that was her, horror. No, she had 3 jobs, and she was working her way through college to be a sculptor. And she said, I had this really terrible or weird thing happen to me the other day. And she said she was alone in the house as far as she knew. And she was down in the basement, and she had almost tripped over the cat. There was this sort of a house cat that hung out, and he belonged to somebody, but like it was one of those deals where, but whose cat is he? The story would always change. And she said she had her back turned to him. And keep in mind, this is a really steep flight of stairs with it's hollow underneath with boxes and stuff. And he was sitting above her. And she kind of and then behind her is like just there were people were living down there, but it was also just a big basement. So she's alone as far as she knows, forevermore. And she said, "Good kitty." And anybody who's read The Croning will remember that there's a scene I have where somebody says in the cellar to the cat, Boris, "Good kitty." And what happens? Call and response. A voice behind her said, "Good kitty." Just like that. That's how she described it.
God.
She said it was slightly higher pitched, like a falsetto that goes down the register into it deeper, but it was like, "Good kitty," like that. She said she just about loosed her bowels. She said she froze. She was with the dryer or something. She turned, there's nobody behind her. And then she looked up and the cat was kind of behind her, but I kind of like she had to go back like this and look up, and the cat was just staring at her. And she said she couldn't shake the feeling that the cat had somehow that the cat had said it. And she goes, I know that's crazy. That was, give her credit. She wasn't like, you got to believe me, the cat. No, she was just like, I think somebody was hiding down there. She knocked on the door to see if nobody. All right. And I'm ashamed to say this, the first couple times she reported, because then we moved her into a different apartment, right? This little 1-bedroom apartment, this long, skinny apartment. On one end, you've got a living area that's pretty small. It's probably the size of this office I'm in, a bathroom, a tiny kitchenette, and then a little living area with sliding doors. And it looked out over the street. And so we move her into that. And she starts telling me, she goes, I'm hearing voices. And I said, well, what do you mean? Like in your head? She goes, no. She goes, in the room. She goes, you know how you can tell when something's in the room or not? She goes, this is like full on sentences and laughing and things like laughter and things like that. And she said it was happening at all hours, but generally during the day. And she said it happened like 4 or 5 times. And she said, she heard like a little voice behind her while she's doing dishes would snicker like that. Okay. I behave like every dude in every freaking horror movie ever. Oh, honey, it's not that I think you're insane, but you've been under a lot of stress lately. Well, I tried to be kindly, but I certainly didn't laugh at her, but I didn't believe there was anything to it whatsoever. I was like, well, it's an apartment building. On the other side of that living room wall, there's another living room and there are people in there. There are people on the other side of us. There were no people on either end, but there were people on either side. I said, and it was a secure, and this is going to become important. This is a security building. It had security inside, like in the inner courtyard. The doors all had deadbolts on the inside, and you had to have one of those big old industrial keys to use the elevator, which you had to come into the complex to get to the elevator. And there was a front door that was a security door. So, and you had to buzz your way in or have a key. All right. Absolutely, people can sneak in. I mean, somebody holds the door open for somebody and they're in. But the point was, it was a secure building. And so I didn't believe her. One night, we're sitting there, and I remember I had the TV kind of turned down, and she was behind the couches, like the futon was up against the wall, and the wall is paper thin, and on the other side is the kitchen. So she's like literally 2 feet away from me, and she was making some food. And to my left, so on my good side, there's a beanbag about 6 feet away. There's a beanbag on the floor that we had, and it's up against the wall. So that you got the picture. I could literally almost, lean one way or the other and touch the beanbag. So I'm sitting there, and I turned the TV down, and I said, because I think she was making me something, and so I just said something like, I said, "I love you," something like that. And she goes, "Oh, I love you." And a third voice goes, "I love you," just like that. It's hard to do it justice because it was from the beanbag, and it was really soft, but it was you know what it sounded like? It sounded like an adult imitating a child is sort of what it was readier than what I can do, but it was like, "I love you." And the part about that creeped me out is it could have been a microphone. There could have been a hole in the wall that somebody was, there's all these things that someone could do to manufacture this, right? But low tech solutions for this, but it definitely was in the room. It didn't originate in another room. I could feel and this is before I lost my hearing in my ear. I lost my hearing a couple of years after that. So what happened is I'm sitting here like this, kind of bug-eyed, not, like she described when she heard the voice in the basement, you just freeze. You're like, okay, you're processing. She goes, "Honey," she goes, "Did you?" And I said, "Did you?" And she goes, "No." So I immediately felt a lot of remorse for doubting her, because I didn't leap to the conclusion. Right. I did not leap to the conclusion that anything weird was going on in the supernatural sense. Just that, she's heard someone, mocking her in this apartment.
But definitely that something is going on.
Oh, absolutely. I heard it. We both heard it.
Yeah.
So weird things really started happening. One of the reasons we moved out of that apartment was she was finishing college, and it was wonderful to move out of that apartment, because here I am living in the Bundy house, and it's creepy. That place was like structurally creepy full of creepy people doing creepy things. And I never once had. The worst thing that ever happened is that people reported somebody was going around trying the women's doorknobs at night. Women were complaining somebody was trying to get in their rooms, which is bad, but there was some creep trying to get in their rooms. They would like wake up and hear the doorknob rattling, but you kept your doors locked in that place. But this place was this clean, neat little, no personality. It was in a no person. It wasn't on Frat Row. It was about a mile from from where my apartment was. And I stayed with her all the time. And we started hearing like just weird stuff, just weird things would start happening around the apartment. Things would go missing. It got to the point, and this is, I was paranoid, but I was also rational. I actually set up, I came to believe that maybe somebody with a key was breaking in, because things would disappear and then reappear later. And like one of the things that happened.
No shit.
Oh yeah. Like
wow.
She had photographs disappear off her. And there's always like if an objective third party is listening, they're like, well, maybe you hid them. Maybe she hid them, right? Maybe a third party hid them. Any of these explanations are creepy, because things that would, if I'm just did it, and telling tales about it, that's creepy. There's something wrong with me. If she was doing it,
if you did it and you don't remember you did it, that's
creepy. Right, exactly. If she did it and for those types of reasons or explanations, that was creepy. And if a person was sneaking in, or if it was, as some people would like to say, supernatural intrusion, any of those responses or explanations bother me kind of equally. Maybe, to be honest, the more mundane, rational explanations would bother me more than some kind of weird alleged poltergeist activity.
Right, but in regards to the voices, you guys both started hearing them.
We heard them. Pictures would disappear. Like she had those like little, like various size, like almost wallet size photos. A couple disappeared. We off the fridge. We thought they'd fallen and gone under the fridge, and we didn't think about it. And I remember once, because I dated her for a couple of years while she had that apartment. And at the end of a couple of years, we found one of them. We found one of the photographs, and it was inside a box, open box, inside another book, under a bunch of books that had dust on them, that she hadn't touched them in a long time. Wow. So somebody, whomever, somebody put that in there, because one of the things that I thought is maybe mice, because mice will do, if something falls on the floor, they'll grab it. I was searching for any kind of real explanation, but what happened once, we went to leave the apartment, and I had the big security key, and I had the apartment key, but they're big, heavy keys, and I'm locking it. And I had this really horrible day job. I was working as for the tree service. So this was like on a Saturday, so the day off. I was exhausted all the time. I was kind of rummy. And after like the third or fourth time, I tried to throw the deadbolt from the outside. You have to use the key. It wasn't staying. And I'm just like, I wasn't thinking. I'm just like staring off into space. It makes me wonder how often weird things happen to us that we don't even notice because we're so oblivious. She grabbed my shoulder, and her fingers she just about crushed into my shoulder like a bird of prey. And I looked down, and this is like the fourth or fifth time I watched the key snap back. Somebody was on the other side throwing the deadbolt. Every time I locked it, they'd snap it and unlock it. This happened. So after I was aware of it, it happened at least 3 more times. I am not kidding. I don't know how to explain it. I would lock it, and then it would literally, the key would twist in my fingers and it would go back the other way.
That's it. To the audience, take a moment and imagine that this is actually happening to you.
Yeah.
It's creepy as hell.
It was really creepy. And so being me, I get that door open immediately and zoom around in the apartment. There's nobody in the apartment. There's no rational reason. So I honestly do not think there was anybody, and there was no place to hide. There was no place to have fled in time. So I don't have an explanation. I'm not saying it was anything supernatural. It was just, but it was another weird thing that happened.
But something was opening the deadbolts several times, and your girlfriend was aware of it, not just you, but she was aware of it too.
And the deadbolt there's all different types of deadbolts. This was like one of the typical ones in the apartment. It was a knob. Mm-hmm. And it's like one of those, the shape like a blimp. It's a long skinny knob, and you twist it. It's not, and it wasn't like just twist it like this. If I recall, you had to turn it like it actually had to turn. It wasn't just like because there are some you can just kind of go like this. Even that, I I don't understand. It was heavy. So that happened.
And again, you have two people witnessing it.
Oh yeah, she was crying, like she had
Yeah.
tears. She was white. She
Yeah.
did not. I did not notice it. If she hadn't said something, I probably would have just kept trying it until it did it. I thought it was operator error until I actually noticed. So then what happened is we go out and we come back and I'm doing something and she cries out. I hear her give out like a exclamation. And I walk in, and keep in mind, we have been together this whole time. We were gone for a couple hours. I saw it before she even said it. I walk into the bathroom. We had a shower curtain, and on the outside of the shower curtain, there were frogs. It was just, just a lame $5 shower curtain, $2 shower curtain. It had been reversed. It was so the transparent side with no screen printing on it is on the outside. It would have been easy to do because, shower curtains, you just clip them on there. Someone had pulled those down, had pulled it down and rotated it. And I know for a fact that it was neither one of us, because you can forget. First of all, why would we have reversed it? But I remember leaving because I was in the bathroom 10 seconds before we left. It was just like it always is. It was just closed. And it was on the outside with the frogs. It was literally one of those opaque ones. You cannot, maybe held up to a lamp.
Yeah,
but,
hang on a second. This is the same incident as the lock.
Yeah.
Right. And so then you guys go out somewhere,
come back,
and you're there together the whole time. Mm-hmm. And then you come back and the shower curtain is reversed.
Right. And so she was really upset, and I was too. And you know what my conclusion was? We had a landlady, and this is like a huge apartment building, right? There's 200 people in it. I'm not sure there's that many, but it was big. It was 2 stories, and it was a big, like a horseshoe shape. So, and it was fairly long. So there were a lot of apartments, and there was this old, sweetest, nicest senior citizen. She was probably in her late 70s, early 80s. I mean, she could barely get around. Who had, when we got locked out of our place, she would, come up and help us, or unlock us. It happened a couple times over the course of time. But my first thought was, she's the only other person. I didn't even have a key. My girlfriend had the key, and when I was using it, I was just borrowing it from her. I don't even think I had a key. And so my girlfriend had the key. This lady had the key. And of course, I'm Occam's razor. I'm like, okay, she's coming into this is the only explanation. But what I immediately moved to from there is that it's unlikely that she had, personality wise, that would be interested in doing it, but also just it doesn't make sense. She didn't physically, it would be just a lot of just impractical, even if she wanted to. They're like, oh, but she has kids, because she had adult children who would come and visit her. And I'm like, somebody's getting a hold of the keys and they're coming in the apartment and they're looking for stuff. That made total sense to me. And you know what? I thought that was still a horrifying explanation. So that's going on. The third thing that happened in this chain is we started talking about, well, college is almost over. We're going to move anyway, but should we move earlier? Or should we move her earlier? And I mean, I was over there so much, I might as well have been living there. And I remember I was lying on the bed and really just exhausted, because this is like, to be honest, in some ways, this really upset me, because it's just one more thing. That's how I was looking at it. I wasn't looking at it like I'm scared. I was looking at like, now we're being messed with by, this is just one more thing. I'm so tired. I just don't even, you've got finals. This is just too much.
Right.
And so I had the key in my hand, and this was the key to a key in my hand. It was a key to the elevator. And anybody who's ever had these are super thick. These are like not even truck keys. They're heavier than truck. You could probably give somebody a lobotomy with one. I mean, they're that thick. So what happened is I had my hand on it, and it was on a keychain, or so, I can't remember. I think the house keys were all on the one chain. I remember I was holding them, and we were talking, and I got up and we decided to go get some coffee. And this was like a few days later. And I went to plug the key into the quickest way to get outside. I went to plug the key in, and I looked down because the key wasn't working. It had been bent. The key was bent by, it wasn't a 90-degree angle, but it was like this. Instead of being this, it was this. I literally had to put the tip of the key into the, because it was a security elevator. I put the tip in, and I was about 250 pounds at the time. I was lifting weights. I was very strong. Not strong enough with one hand, though, to bend a key. I had to take my whole weight, and I was able to, I don't know if anybody's ever done this, but the key was long enough, like a dagger. I was able to bend it back into shape. but it took me, I showed her and she's like, oh my God, what's happening? And I
Yeah,
bent
this
the
isn't
key.
just something that accidentally happens with
No,
a
I
key
bent the
that thick.
key. I bent the key all the way back. And always after that had that tiny little, but I literally had to put my body weight on it and I was able to do it, which goes to follow that it could have been done that way in the first place. You put it part way in it and you bend it. I have no, it was fine when we had used the elevator 20 minutes before. It wasn't fine 20 minutes later. Fourth thing that happened, one night I was lying on that bed and I was working on my novel. I had injured my back. And so I was taking some time off from the tree service. I ruptured a disc in my back and was almost crippled. So I remember I was lying on the bed and I was working on my novel. And back in those days, I didn't type. I didn't have a computer. She had a computer, but I didn't at the time, didn't, borrow it or anything. So I was using pencil and pen to write this, now a trunk novel. And it was about 300,000 words. So I was just working like crazy on that thing. And I'm lying on the bed and she's not in the room, no pets. Really hard to describe this, but I think it all kind of ties together. Is I felt a plucking on the small of my back, like if somebody delicately with the tweezers even, or your long fingernails, got a hold of the fabric and was plucking it. And I felt it like in two different spots. And at first I was just like, a bug I'm like, no, somebody was plucking at my shirt. The next thing that happened is, and this is, people talk about a lot of hauntings. They talk about levitation. They talk about being lifted. I experienced it. I don't know what it is, but it is the only time I've ever had it happen. It's a truly remarkable and discombobulating experience. It didn't feel like someone picking me up. It felt like, because this is what happened right after the plucking. The plucking goes away. I remember I said something. I said, honey, I'm having this strange, I told her I'm having this strange experience. And she walked in, she says, what? And about that time, I felt like under my, I had rolled onto my side. And so under my hip, wherever my body was in contact with the bed. So I was sort of like in repose on my side. So under my hip and my ribs, up to my ribs, the only way I could describe it would be like a spatula or like some really flat, thin object like you might use to actually a bodyboard is now in retrospect. And it hit all those areas at once. Like when somebody slides their hand under you, their fingers are here and their thumb is there, and there's like pressure change. There was no pressure change in relation to where I was being touched. It was the same pressure from my hip to the sort of the middle of my back or side. And I was lifted. Now I'm 250 pounds. I literally was lifted, I would say 1.5 inches, 2 inches, to the point where my upper body started sagging. So like I was like, in other words, only that part of my body was going up. Either end of my body was, so I was kind of bending a little bit. I asked her if she saw it, and she said that it didn't lift me enough. I don't think from standing next to me, you could see it. She said, she goes, you just had this weird look on your face. And she said, you kind of look like vertigo. Like I did that. And it went away. It was like, I don't know how long it lasted, a couple seconds, but I literally was lifted and it kind of went away. And then there was like almost like another surge of it. It was really stealthy. I get the creeps. This is the first part of this conversation. I've gotten the creeps because it felt like someone was sliding something under me, trying for me not to notice. It was definitely not like the plucking.
Wow.
All of it was like trying to do it stealthily. So now, no witness. She only, all she would be a witness for is that I was telling her something was happening. The next thing that happened is we came home. This all happened like over the course of a few weeks, maybe even a few months. We came home one day, and this is kind of was the culminate, not quite the culmination, but maybe the worst thing that happened. And we'd been in a coffee shop, which is about 1.5 miles away, and we walked to it and walked back.
Oh yeah, this one. Oh,
Wow.
Wow.
There was a message, and keep in mind we haven't heard any more voices. I said, "Have you?"
No, wait a minute. Didn't you say something to her at the coffee shop?
Yeah,
Okay.
I had told her. I said to her, I said, she did something for me, or I had done something for her, and I said, "You're so sweet," and she goes, "No, you're sweet. You're so sweet."
This
and
is at the coffee shop.
Yeah, and in this tone of voice, it's a fairly crowded coffee shop. There's people all around. But
Mhm.
we were just sitting by ourselves, and I just said to her about this tone of conversation. I said, no, you're sweet. You're so sweet. Or vice versa. I can't remember quite.
Right.
And gave her a hug. And we paid right then. We were just leaving. Walked back to the place, directly back, no deviation, went right back to the house. We walk inside and the lights blinking on the machine, the phone, the answering machine. I gotta tell you, man, I didn't know something was wrong, but when happened, I was not. It was almost like, yeah, of course. I just had this foreboding, and I can't remember if she answered or I did, but I remember when I heard it, it was the intercom. When you buzz in, if you're not home, well, actually, even if you are home, it rings. It would ring the phone. It wasn't. We didn't have a thing on the wall. It was just the phone. The phone,
Right.
and we had to
Yeah.
answer the phone. We. I have always been a not won't answer the phone guy. But
Me too.
that was one of those places where you kind of have to answer the phone because people might come over and blah, blah, blah. So I pick up the phone and I'm listening to it and it's street noise. And I'm like, okay, this definitely, this is the street. And then there was this garbled, like
This is
breathing.
somebody on the intercom outside. This is not
Yep.
somebody calling. Yeah.
Yep. This is somebody on the intercom. You could, when they spoke, I mean, we've had many people talk to us on the intercom. It was obvious.
Mhm.
And this person must have had their mouth up to it because they said, and once again, I am not going to be able to do it justice, but it's something along the lines of, "You're so sweet," just like that. Their voice cracked. It was
Oh
it
my
was
God.
guttural and yet breathy. And if people who have closely read my work, I've had more than one villain have this. Like, is it an old woman? Is it a child? Is it guttural or is it high? Is it falsetto? It was like it traveled. It was like they're almost like they were aspirating. They're like, "You're so sweet," and I'm not doing it justice. It. I was a borderline. I was just before. I never tested for black belt, but I was on my way to becoming a black belt in what I would consider a pretty lethal form of martial arts. It's street combat. And I only got into it just, because I wanted to have a few skills. I wasn't, paranoid or anything. I was just like, hey, I always wanted to, I didn't know how freaking serious this was. It was just what was offered. And it turns out, it's like military style, Krav Maga style martial arts. I was always armed. I always had knives and stick on me. And I didn't, I'm big. I was, I had shaved head at the time and I'm just like, nobody mess with me. So I didn't go around with any kind of apprehension unless I was in a bad part of town. There was a group of people. This scared the piss. I am not that right there. The only time I've ever been before or since, there's only been one occasion I've been that scared since. And the only time prior was when I thought my dog team and I were going through the ice. The ice cracked under us. And that winter, several people I know, well, two people I know had died. Somebody else I didn't know had died from going through the ice with their dog teams because the weather was so bad. The ice wasn't safe and different. This is all across. This is in Michigan, Canada, and Alaska. And I thought I was next. I thought we were next. It just, my mom. This is the only time I've ever had that level of, or if you look up and you see a car in your lane coming at you, it's just that moment of it was horrible. So we called the cops.
And it's recorded.
Yes. Called the police. I'm certainly not somebody, wasn't then, I'm not now. Hey, get the cops. But it seemed the prudent thing to do. I figured somebody was messing with it. And so a beat cop came. He listened to it. I will never forget his expression or what he said. He was a young guy. I was 28, 29 at the time. He was probably about the same age, maybe a little bit younger. His face went white as my girlfriend's had when the deadbolt was, and when she heard this. He looked like it was his house. And I said, what do you think? He goes, that's horrible. He goes, that's horrible. I think that's the term he used. He goes, that's horrible. And I said, we're not being paranoid. That sounds like hostile. He goes, it sounds like someone wants you to be. He goes, yeah. He goes, and I said, well, he goes, I can't do anything. And I said, he went and looked at the intercom. He buzzed us the whole, we went through the whole thing. He did do what he could. And I said, listen, I know you can't do anything. One of the aspects of my martial arts training was you do everything you can before you ever are put in a position, if you can, to ever be in a self-defense situation. One of those things is attacks on people, like break-ins. A lot of times have there's preamble. Oh yeah, these guys were hanging around my house for a week and looking in the windows, that kind of thing. They called my house to see when I was home. Maybe they were following me. A couple of the guys that I trained with they were studying that martial arts system because they had been the victims of home invasions. I had cops I was training with. One of the cops had taken their case, had come to their house. And that's why they came to the martial arts studio. So rule one, you call the police if something like this happens and you get the paperwork going. That way,
right. You get it on record. 6
weeks later, when the guy's coming through your window and you snap his neck in self-defense, it's not like, well, why, you had no reason. No, there's a doc. You've been stalked or you're worried. So I did. And the cop said he would be scared. He goes, if I were you, yeah. I said, well, we're moving. So he goes, good. He goes, I hope you're moving out of town. He really, he was just like, he did not like it. And the reason he didn't like it is there's just no way, despite trying to recreate it for you, that I can, the sounds of it were obscene. Like when they talk about obscene phone call, this is definitely obscene, though, in a more almost like spiritual level. That he didn't say anything negative. He just repeated his phrase that we had used to each other 20 minutes.
And the thing is, when you and I were on the phone talking about this, what we were talking about was that if a person did this, first of all, how the fuck did he do it? How did he beat you there? And how did he hear you in the coffee shop? But if a person did this, it's almost or possibly equally as creepy as if there's a paranormal explanation. It's creepy no matter what.
That's my point, is that I'm not proposing that anything extraordinary happened, only that, or excuse me, occult, just that this is what we went through. And I'm sure somewhere, maybe it's been thrown out by now, but the Seattle police responded to and noted, he took a report that someone had left us a call. So, and it bothered him, and like I said, this is all just circumstantial stuff, but it bothered him too. It wasn't just me and my girlfriend caught up in it. This dude who was never going to see us again was worried for us. That's what he said. He said to my girl, I'm worried for you guys. So please call us if you hear anything, if you see anybody, because people had tried to, had cased the building before. They've gone around. So that's where I was. But the part that upset me is how did someone overhear us and then make it back? And maybe they jumped in a car and zipped up there. But the level of planning, or not even planning, but just who does,
and
who
why
does that? Yeah. And driving in Seattle isn't so easy. It's actually sometimes faster to walk somewhere. I mean, for someone to have gotten into a car wherever it was parked and then get up there and be able to find parking, there was never any parking around our place. So, I mean, I've gone through and looked at all the logical explanations, and even, to be honest, the logical ones creep me out more, because the level of determination someone would have to do that,
and the level of
is obsessive
insanity for them to talk that way is off the charts.
Yeah. And like I said, man, I'm a wary person. I mean, that's why I took martial arts. I mean, it was an extension of how I grew up. There are people who want to shoot you, if you live, if you live in the wilderness. There are animals that do not like you being there. They'll stomp on you or bite you or whatever. It was always like utilitarian. It was never, I'm going to be Bruce Lee or something like that. It was always just,
it's a plan B. If I get attacked, I've got skills to.
Well, it's just kind of peripheral, but I have been witness to 4 muggings in my day. A couple of them, they were attempted muggings on me, and I have actually 5, because the one I couldn't do anything about, and I have disrupted 2 muggings, and none of it was overly dramatic. Right, I never had to use combat. One case, the guy had a knife and was chasing a woman, and literally chasing her, and I called out to him, and he turned around. I didn't see it at the time, but he had a knife in his hand. It was the middle of the night, and she came out of an office, and he was following her. And a couple times, guys snuck out of cars and were coming up on me, crouched with their hands out to tackle me. And the police had reported to watch out, because there was a guy in the neighborhood mugging people. He'd tackle you, men and women, didn't care. He's a big guy. And I could see why when I saw him. He was probably 6'4", 6'5". Even when he was first crouched, he was big. So the point is that I wasn't really paranoid, but I never lived in the city. And so I was just like, yeah, you're going to have bite off a mouthful there, buddy, if you're going to mug me. And I'm not going to watch somebody get mugged. I'm going to feel confident that I can step in.
Right.
And so that was where I was coming from. Wary, but very confident. Like I, felt very, like, almost like, like like an animal myself, like, I'm ready to deal with you on your own terms. That I wasn't. To this day, I just look at that and I just shake a little bit when I think about it, because it was not, even if it's rational, how do you even deal with someone like that? You don't even know what they're capable of. I mean, they're physically, mentally, you don't even know if you could handle them. And so,
the other thing is that I've been friends and am friends with a few cops, and I've gone on ride-alongs with a couple of my friends,
mhm,
and they get a lot of calls that are frankly bullshit,
yeah,
and they note it, they're polite, they nod, they take the report, but that's it. If there's nothing that they can do, there's nothing that they can do. So I know that mindset somewhat. And my wife was a ADA, and I through her dealt with a lot of cops, so I'm used to the mindset.
yeah, me too.
For a cop to go into your apartment there and to listen to that recording and then go white and get scared himself says a lot.
I thought so, because at the time, my life, and I just gotten back into writing. Like, as I said, I was working on that novel, but my life prior to injuring myself, even after injuring myself, was really dedicated to this really extreme lifting. Because when I went to Seattle, I was a 170-pound skinny kid, and by the time, and I was like, early 20s, mid 20s. By the time I hit 30, I weighed close to 260, and I could literally transform myself. And I had studied this, like, religiously studied this, gone to this dojo for about 6 years. I used to go sometimes 6 times a week. There was like a one day a week was twice, and it was a 2-mile walk each way. And I this is what I did. I did the minimal jobs that I had to do. And that's why I was talking about the start of the show. I felt like at some point I felt like I had to kind of change my life and do something a little more serious. But I was really serious about the dojo. I loved it. And it is a weird thing to transform your body. And the reason these things were important to me is I had spent the entire first 20 something years of my life working on a farm ranch situation where my life is not my own. You never get a day off when you have animals. I don't mean pets, but like, you have 30 sled dogs, you have chickens, you have a horse, whatever. You are chained to that life. There is nothing for yourself. There's simply variations on the theme of, I got to take care of the animals. And so this was something for me. That's when I got into reading a lot of Shakespeare, Machiavelli. Like, it was a good time for me, and it turned me into, I think, it gave me the tools to be a much better writer, because I had written over 1 million words in my life prior to that, but I was pretty not very competent. Part of that was lack of education. That time I spent going to the dojo, which was very cerebral. We were required to do mini essays to get our belt levels on crime and the relation self-defense has with crime and things like that. It transformed me physically and mentally. So I was, and I worked with a lot of, to your point, that dojo I was one of the only civilians in the dojo. Almost everybody else there was an EMT, paramedic, helicopter pilot. We had 3 or 4 different lawyers. 2 of them were King County prosecutors. One of them was the King County prosecutor, DA, for a while. We're talking like, if they were making a TV series, he would have had one of the leading roles. And right. I guess one other guy the guy had been home invaded, and another guy was a civilian. He'd had his face slashed. And so, but almost everybody there was a cop. I worked with Navy SEALs. I worked with Vietnam era Force Recon. These are serious people. So
yeah, and
yes,
DAs and ADAs. I mean, Danielle got all kinds of threats.
right. That's why the one guy was training there. He had his life threatened credibly on several occasions, and that dude he had armament. He had like this aluminum 38 pistol. And he wore this blouse, like these kind of puffy silk shirt. He was, obviously dresses really nicely, suit and tie. You couldn't tell that he had fixed blade knife. He had a knife in his heel, like on his ankle, and he carried at least one revolver, and it was the kind of thing that would fit in your. It's like not much thicker than it's a little bit thicker, like a pack of cigarettes. It's this really, they call them I want to say air lights, but they're like made out of some kind of aluminum. The
Well,
point
he was
is
definitely not wearing an off the rack suit. He had
no,
that
no, no.
tailored to hide those.
He had it hidden with his suspenders. He had the strap. I never, because other people would come in wearing. I mean, the cops would come in, wearing their off duty, their off duty carry pistols and stuff, and you could see them if you knew what to look for. This guy never. When he started pulling out the weapons, I was just like, wow. And he said, yeah, he wouldn't talk about it, but they'd caught somebody like coming into his house type of thing at one point, like something like that. They'd gotten really close to him. And he said, I'm going to have to take some matters in my own hands. And he always carried a walking stick. So the point is, I guess it's all just sort of tangential, but these are the people I'm with. These aren't, maybe some of them were yahoos, but generally speaking, pretty much everybody there was an embassy guard who had been an embassy guard overseas. He was a Marine. They all had pretty good reasons, as if you have to have one, but they actually had like pressing reasons. The EMTs actually and the paramedics even more than the cops. They said cops are carrying guns and they're looking for trouble, to stop trouble. He goes, I'm busy trying to give you mouth to mouth, and your wife comes up and stabs me in the back of the neck. Not to pick on your wife, but I mean, there's always, they respond to crime scenes and have no way to defend themselves. They're busy. So he said he actually, was attacked by a knife wielder and had to fight the guy off. And so he came and started studying, all to the point that when I saw that cop behave the way he did, it was pretty tough. It was pretty emotional for me. I said, oh, we're not in a very good situation here, and nothing ever came of it. But there is a conclusion to the story, I guess I should give you. And I hesitate to, because it is a cult. It is bizarre in its ramifications. So I'm just going to go ahead with it.
Yeah, please.
I put no label on this. This is just what I saw.
All right.
I could have been hallucinating. So not long before we left, I would say about 6 months before we left, I was getting really close to finishing that novel. So this would be 99. So I guess I guess we still were there for a little bit. We might've been there until 2000, but it was like definitely deep into the time that we stayed at that apartment in Seattle. So I hurt my back, ruptured a disc. It was so bad that it was loose. I had to go to the doctor. They wanted to operate on my spine. But I said no. They said we wouldn't get any worse. Just I'd be in a lot of pain, which I am to this day. They said there's like a 10% chance we could paralyze you. I said, I'll deal with the pain. But it was like a gelatin pack back there. It finally had to be absorbed by the body, but you could touch the small of my back, and there was a big old lump back there, and that was my disc that had completely turned inside out. It just burst, and that was that. So I have an incredible amount of pain. Not taking any medication for it though, which I think is important. I was just taking over the counter, aspirin. And it was one of those deals where I was in a chair position a lot of the time if I was seated, and my girlfriend would have to grab me by the arms and I would lift me up. I couldn't just stand. My back wouldn't straighten. And I was writing the novel. Initially I was writing the novel at a coffee shop. So now I can't go to work. I'm literally, in terrible pain, crippling, basically like disability. I'm lying on my stomach in the living room all the time. I'll never forget this. And I'm working on that novel. I just worked on it even harder. So I have this 3-ring binder, and I'm in like the third or fourth 3-ring binder for this novel, because it came out to about 1,000 pages. And those binders, after about 250, 300 pages are too full. So I'm like in the third one, right? And I'm just scribbling away working. I went to bed, left it lying on the floor. It was just, I think she helped pull me up, and I said, just leave it there. I'll get back on it in the morning. So my pen's lying beside it. My thing, it's open to whatever page I'm working on. Go to bed. And I wake up and it's dawn, and it's not dark at all, but it's not full sunlight yet. Sunlight's still like hitting the buildings. So you've got like this nice light but it's soft, diffuse light. Okay. And the places that are not getting that light are dark. But down the hallway and into the living room where I heard the little voice, there's no direct sunlight, but I can see quite clearly. So I get out of bed, I struggle out of bed. I could get out, if getting out of bed was possible because I could roll over and put my feet down. But it literally took me like 2 minutes to get up. I finally,
very familiar, believe me.
Right. I had to do the thing. The pain was so bad that I would sweat would be pouring down my face when I had to move. Like if I was like, I have to go sit on the toilet, sitting down or standing back up, it would be like, I would have to psych myself up. I'd be like, okay, all right, you can do this. So I went to open the bedroom door, and it's this long, and it's not long. I mean, it's a 1 bedroom apartment, but 25 feet, 30 feet, whatever it is. I just knew. I just knew. And that could be psychologically, could be that maybe the evidence I was hallucinating. But what I saw when I opened it, so I got that feeling, and the feeling was every time I've ever had the feeling in my life, and I look and there's a person staring at me, or there's an animal, like there's a bear in the bushes or something. I got that feeling, but I wasn't, it was just, I was in a lot of pain. And I took like 2 or 3 steps, and it's a soft shag, not shag, but that soft carpeting you get in the apartment. So I'm not making any noise. I don't even know how to, I mean, I've told John this, I've told like a very small handful of people this, but like my goose bumps just all over my body right now. I saw a cat, the world's blackest cat was sitting on the floor in the middle of the living room, kind of like almost hunkered over my manuscript.
Wow.
And it was staring, it was kind of pointed toward me, but looking down at the manuscript. And this went on, I want to say the whole experience was at least 10 seconds. It might have been longer. So it's a long time. You start counting to 10. This was a long time. I'm standing there with my mouth kind of open, because there's a it was like the sliding glass door was a couple of feet to the left. So any light coming in, there was like the floor was brighter there. It was sitting not in the dark, not even in the shadows, just in a dimmer part where the light was just right behind the manuscript. And so this cat's sitting there, and I looked at the sliding glass door, because we had this giant squirrel that we could actually let the squirrel in. Sometimes he'd run in and grab treats and then run off. He went to every freaking apartment and panhandled. And so all this stuff's going through my mind. Did we leave it open? Because you could, but there's no way we would, because it would have filled the apartment with noise. It was a street. There was a tree, and then the street. It was not open. None of the windows. There's nothing. Nothing's open. And I'm looking at this like, and all I was thinking, probably in the first second or two, how'd this cat get in here? And that's a damn big cat. The more I'm looking at it, the more I'm realizing that it's so black that it's in profile. So I don't know how to describe this, but like if you were wearing all black and you were on a stage with the light only on your face, it would look like your head's floating. But if your face you wore a black mask and you hunch down, somehow could get your shoulders up, your head would disappear into your body. And this is how I was like, is this really a hallucination? Because when the cat turned, its head was up, like kind of craned looking. And I thought I saw a cat ear. That's what my mind supplied, is that it's a black cat. It wasn't a cat. It completely changed. When it turned, its head lowered, like in defense posture. It became just a blob for a second. So that's a really weird to be hallucinating that level of detail, because I would never have thought of that. So it's just this blob sitting there. So it was physiologically, that's how the physics would be of something that's one color, and it's a dark color like that. You wouldn't see any detail. There was no other detail. There was no eye color. There were no teeth. There's nothing. What it was, and then it turned in profile, and it looked, I thought it was a child. And then my brain goes, that's not it. And we're talking like, it's probably, if I were like to compare it to a small dog, like a King Cavalier size, but I hate to use animals because it didn't look like an animal anymore. I would say 30 pounds, an object that's probably about 30 pounds. It may be heavier if it's, so you get the idea. It's the size of a toddler probably at this point. I'm looking at it going, I can't tell if it's changing shape or if I'm just now apprehending. It looked like a gargoyle. And when I remember talking to my girlfriend later, I'm like, well, no wonder people, have back in the olden days saw things, and they were like, they associated, what are 2 things associated with bad things? Well, gargoyles less so. But the other world, black cats and gargoyles. You see gargoyles, they're usually defensive creatures, but they're still otherworldly creatures. People obviously have seen things like this, and they would decide that it was black cats are evil, or gargoyles or signaling. And so it had kind of pointed ears, and it had a defined neck, and it had a large head and a large body, and it definitely had limbs that were sort of cat-like. And it looked at me and I could feel the weight of whatever it was looking at me, which also is a weird detail for a hallucination.
Right.
and it jumped. It was reading my fucking manuscript. Is what, if I were writing a story, that's exactly what was happening. It leaped, and when it leaped, it didn't leap like high into the air. It just kind of like darted forward. And as it crossed where the light, and the light was getting brighter by the second in the room, right? And there was a patch of light on the wall and the leaves. You could see the pattern of the leaves, the shadows. It leaped into that, and it elongated and turned into just like something out of a goddamn horror movie. It was a black, I don't want to say mist, but it looked like if you pour certain substances into water and they swirl and they don't, it's like oil and water, like
Right.
they're on the surface. It
Right.
didn't, and it broke into these little, like tiny little exploding particles, and where it hit the wall, the wall went black. Is the only thing I can kind of describe it. And then it did the same thing, and then it was just leaves again. I stood there, and I was probably 15 feet away, 20 feet. Probably closer to 20. I stood there like that for a long time. And to this day, I'm probably still standing there. And my conclusion is nothing. I have no conclusion about that. The safest, most logical conclusion is my mind is my brain's producing chemicals to fight off my terrible injury. And maybe I even created an ending to this whole scenario, or an explanation for all this weird stuff that had happened at our apartment. My point being is I experienced it. The mind is either something bigger is going on, or the mind is just an incredible machine that you can't trust, that you cannot trust your perceptions. I leave you to go either way with that. Either explanation, that it's a hallucination or that I saw something inexplicable, to me are the ramifications of either direction are pretty astounding, because I didn't have further hallucinations. I've never had anything like that before. I've seen some weird things, but they were so far at a distance that I'm like, that could be an animal of some kind. I've never seen anything up close that defies my rational mind the way that did.
If we assume, just for the sake of argument for 1 minute, that it was a hallucination, your previous experience with the intercom and the answering machine and the coffee shop, the "you're so sweet" thing, that can't be discounted. We're talking about 3 people who heard this.
Right. This is just a
yeah.
coda. I put this forward. This is purely entertainment.
No, I understand.
And this part, the thing in the apartment, it's just hearsay. But literally, if an investigative reporter, and I don't know how long police keep records, I think forever though, you could theoretically check my story with the police, the Seattle PD, about summoning someone to the apartment. And I don't know what they would say, but the point is that this is a story that's been told to the police, and the police have, well, actually, it's not even a story. It's just like, because that was just something that was recorded, a voice on a recorder. So that's I thought that might entertain you guys. Like I said, it's a weird ending to it. And like I said, I'm very cautious about placing any kind of explanation, because I don't really believe that just because you see a UFO, it indicates it's anything other than a UFO. I don't believe that just because something inexplicable happens, that it means anything other than, that was weird. I don't have a ready explanation.
Yeah, our minds can be open to different possibilities, but it is okay. Once again, it is okay to say, I don't know.
Right. And I think the value of it is just that to even just kind of talk about it, it happened. Even if it's just something innocuous and I was just, still tired or whatever, it just goes to show you, in a more practical sense, that eyewitness testimony, you should always be very careful of.
Oh, absolutely.
Because, right, sincere as it may be, it's fraught with peril. That's why I have a tendency, while I love to listen to people's stories and speculate about them, I have a tendency to say, okay, right, but for us to draw any true conclusion, we would have to have more, some kind of evidence, some kind of corroborative.
Sagan also said that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
Yeah, and I'm right. absence of proof is not, proof of absence, and all this stuff. So yeah,
But
so
we enjoy
that's,
listening to campfire stories
yeah,
that have happened to you, but we also enjoy fictional Laird Barron stories, Paul Tremblay stories, Stephen King, whatever. We are fascinated by this stuff.
yeah, and
You know?
I would say I've drawn most of my inspiration for creepy stories from anecdotes. Like I said, we could do 3 of these shows. I mean, I've collected anecdotes from my family, and by family I mean like extended family, not just
Yeah.
all the
Yeah.
people down through down through as far as back as I've gone. But some of this stuff that's happened to me has crept into my work too, or at least I think in some ways my experiences with the odd or the potentially irrational don't so much appear verbatim in my stories, but they color how I have how I craft the reactions of various people. That people don't really react to the inexplicable the way they do in a horror movie. People don't always just dismiss things, but they also a lot of times don't freak out and start going, "Oh my God, no!" The human mind is just as capable of rationalizing, if not more so, than it is being irrational.
Yeah.
Matter of fact, we do a lot of work to go, no, this is. I think the average person does a lot of work to go, nah, that thing I saw on the road was a trick of the headlights or whatever. I mean, it was cool, but I think typically people do a lot of work trying to explain it. I think it's a much smaller subset of people, or people that are in particular circumstances that would engender a more irrational, embracing the irrational, that do. You live somewhere where maybe you're paranoid all the time for some reason. Maybe you would be more likely. And I
Well,
don't say
I
that
grew
as
up. Yeah, I grew up. I use the word in quotes, school that we went to in this cult, and it was this huge red brick building, and it was a church as well. And when I say huge, I mean huge. There was the sanctuary with the balcony. There was this basement and sub basements, and I would go down there. The church was in the same place as the school. Okay, so it was all in one building. And for whatever reason, if I had to go down to the basement, there was the basement where the restrooms were, and then there was the basement where you go past this door, past the furnace room, and holy crap, I didn't like going down there.
Yep.
Yeah, that was just I won't get into it, but the creepiest feeling,
Yeah. Oh, right. We'd be on it for hours. It was just a matter of,
yeah.
well, there's
Yeah.
a reason why I've written essays about Alaska and compared the feelings I've had when I'm in remote places by myself, and in Montana too. The idea that it's a nervous system, or that it's a like a living, not sentient or sapient organism, but that it's a living biosystem, like a body. And you sometimes get the feeling that you're the foreign object, that the antibodies are being produced to to force you out. The defense
It
system
doesn't
is
want you there.
activated. Yeah, and we could, like I said, we could be on the show for hours. I have had that happen plenty, where I just felt like, yeah, maybe this one spot where I'm sitting overlooking the ocean is not a safe spot to be, because it'd be pretty plausible deniability for the occult universe. Just a little wind draft shoves you off. Everybody's like, oh, that's sad. That's one thing that psychics, there are a lot of psychics up in Alaska, or self-professed psychics. Although I did know one who worked with the police department and found a body, so there was something going there. But they were very intuitive. But she told me, she said, you got to be careful with the numinous, because a lot of it is plausible deniability. That was her belief, that if you make it easy for the universe to to basically corpuscle you out of existence, it will, and it'll look like a tree fell on you. And I don't necessarily believe that, but the point is that it's always been in my mind.
Interesting hypothesis. Yeah.
Yeah. That basically, we're that we are part of the natural system, but that we're still very damaging. That human beings do not live in harmony with our surroundings. And so our surroundings have a tendency to are always in contest with us, which I can tell you is the truth. Don't mow your lawn in the country, or trim the bushes around your house for 6 months and just see what's left. Nature is constantly fighting us.
Right.
The ants want to move in, and nobody wants to cohabitate. They want us out. They want this spot. the same way that we don't cohabitate. We clear, we raise, we burn, we plow things under. So, not to get all naturey, but we are in a constant state of tension. And it would not surprise me if there's that genius loci that the natives, have for millennia have talked about, is that it's not necessarily there's some supernatural force that's disapproving. It's just that we're all part of this, living system, that if you have a hole in your body or you have a foreign object inside your body that's causing damage, your body will do whatever it can to destroy that and expel it. And I don't think that there's probably it's not a big stretch to say that our environment in general might be, have something like that in effect.
All right, 3 more quick things before we go. First of all, are you, don't answer this if you don't want to, but the cat type being thing that was reading your manuscript, which book was it? Is it a trunk book or did you publish it?
I trunked it.
Trunked it? Okay.
Yep.
Second thing I wanted to say was, if you go the other way, ask guys like Nick Bostrom, it's much more likely that we're living in a simulated virtual reality. And, when shit like this happens, someone running the simulation is fucking with us just because they feel like fucking with us.
There's another explanation too that actually I think I'm intrigued by that, but it hasn't progressed to the hard science level enough for me to be more than just interested, but I like it. But there is one that is a hard science explanation. It's being taken quite seriously, is some variation of the many universes. That, in other words, it's very possible that there's not literally there are infinite variations on our reality, and that, we're having this conversation in millions and millions of realities, and there's just some tiny variation on it. If that's true, and this seems to be gaining more and more traction in the mainstream community, scientific community, if that's true, that accounts for many things. It even accounts for a lot of cryptozoology. How can Bigfoot be sighted, and yet how is that we haven't found this giant 9-foot primate? It doesn't seem it really.
Or this many worlds thing. I heard this one.
But if it comes from another dimension, that would be, if there's glitches in the matrix, so to speak, then of course.
Yeah, possibly stupid, but one scientist was going like, "Hey, so play Russian roulette, in theory, don't actually do it, and keep pulling the trigger." All right, so the other yous in the other universes, they're playing Russian roulette too, and one of you isn't going to die, but the rest of you are, possibly. If you keep pulling the trigger, you're the one that doesn't die. So
no, that's I've heard all kinds of theories, and that's something I've incorporated in my writing too. Like I said, I don't know the science behind that thoroughly. I just know, though, that it is a legitimate avenue of inquiry among scientists. I don't know if it's widely accepted, but they're definitely, talking about it. So if that's the case, that would be truly an inexplicable explanation for all kinds of weird things, because if there's an overlapping, because there is the idea that these universes could interface with each other, like frequencies, like a radio station bleeding into the next.
Sunspots, etc.
Right. I didn't see anything weird. I just saw, a distortion from somewhere else. And there's also another explanation is, especially if there's if there are frequencies, or there are alternate dimensions, if this is something that really is, the multi-universe thing, there could be all kinds of intelligences, flora and fauna and other, that we just haven't run across yet. I mean, for a fact, I'm certain that there are species on this planet that we haven't encountered. So that's why I don't totally dismiss cryptozoologists. I just simply say, look, I'm down. I mean, I have relatives who think they've seen Bigfoot, but you'd have to, let's get a blood test, let's get a DNA sample, let's get,
right.
Let's get it. Right. Let's get this on record and verified.
Something besides a fuzzy photograph.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, last but not least, and I have to go, and you probably do too, but you have a quick story, if you feel like telling it, about the desk you are sitting at right now. And I think Jessica told you that she loved you. Is that ringing a bell?
No, I'm
And
not.
then you said, I think you said it back, if I remember from our phone call. And then like somewhere in the room, you heard the same thing. I
No,
love you.
that was the other incident that we've
Oh, it
never had.
was.
Yeah,
Okay.
we've never.
Nothing here.
No, the only not to drag this out any further, but we did have one. I had one odd thing here, and it is kind of weird because it involves a piece of furniture that traveled with me from Washington, where something weird happened there. But yeah, I just only thing that happened here is a couple of years ago, 3 years ago now. I was sitting right here typing away, and I had the two dogs. Athena, it was not long before she died. She'd gone deaf and she was lying on the couch. And Valentina was about 8 months old and she was lying on the floor near me. And I have two bookshelves. You can't see them, but there's two tall bookshelves. And I have like a little reading lamp desk, not desk, but like a stool kind of a thing in between them, right? They're not,
Okay.
it's not,
I think this is what I was thinking of. Yeah.
it's not wedged. It's not wedged or anything like that, but there's no way for it to rotate. Like to rotate, you have to pick it up and pull it out and turn it. And there was a crash. Boom, right here on my good side. I turn, I look, Valentina's raced out of the room. Athena, who's deaf as a post, she stopped snoring and she's like looking around like, what the hell? That lamp was still in place. And I had a lot of heavy, like I had coins on there and I had some candles that are in glass containers. So it's pretty heavy. And then underneath, I have this old wicker, small wicker, like a foot locker, but it's like very small that I bought. I keep certain things in it. The table had been rotated out like almost 90 degrees, not quite 90
Oh,
degrees.
right. I remember now.
And I could see where the impressions, because it's carpeting, but I tried to recreate it. I couldn't because everything went through my mind. Oh, the landlady hit the wall. I mean, we had an earthquake. Yeah, I've been through earthquakes. It would have fallen over, or it would have rattled straight out. You could not turn it because there was not enough room to turn it. When I turned it to put it back, I had to lift it up, like the whole thing up, and then turn it and put it in. So basically, for it to be rotated, it had to have been lifted and then placed back. The one side still against the wall, the side that rotated out on the floor.
While you and the dogs were in the room and didn't
Yeah,
notice.
I
Yeah.
told my landlady about it. I called her and said, what, anything going on down there? And she's like, no, but her husband had basically died up here and he died at the hospital, but this was his space. And she was kind of teasing, but she's like, oh yeah, maybe he's like giving you the business for being in his office. And, so that was her take. But yeah, like that's the only, I've been here at this spot for 6 years now and I've never had any. That's it.
Yeah.
That was about 3 years
My
ago.
fibro thog with that's exactly what I was. Yeah, that's the story I was thinking of.
Well, and the only reason that that's relevant is just because a few back about 12 years ago now, that chest, somebody picked it up while we were downstairs. We're living in Washington, and I walked upstairs, and that chest was sitting in front of my doorway to my office back then, and it had been opened. It had been moved about 4 feet, turned and opened, and it was sitting there open. And my girlfriend or my wife at the time was like, "Why'd you leave that sitting there?" And I said, "I didn't."
Holy shit.
Yeah. And so that's the same piece of furniture. It's this little, and it was sitting under I didn't put that together right away, but a year or two ago when I was talking to Jessica about it, because Jessica was in the other room when all this happened. She was at the opposite end. If you open that door, you can go straight into the living room about 40 feet, 30, 40 feet that way. I guess 30 feet. Yeah. And so that chest was I was in the office. I walked downstairs. It's a small house. There's no other way to get it up there. Sitting there watching. We had 3 big dogs and a cat. We were watching TV. At the end of the show, my wife kept watching TV. I walked upstairs and there it was. And I left it there. And I remember I walked to the bathroom or did something. I was going to talk to her about it. And she walked up and she said, why is that open? Because it was where you would trip over it. It was just crazy. It had only been moved, but it had been facing a different direction. It had been literally brought about 4 feet and set and then opened. And what my mind jumped to is that somebody somehow was in the house. But now that this happened here years later, I'm like,
and it's the same piece of furniture.
Yeah, that's so like I said, man, life is full of. It probably sounds like I have a lot of experiences, but like I literally have been living here for 10 years, and I've had the thing with John at his house, and that's all I've nothing. It's just been very peaceful.
Yeah.
So.
Well, thanks, Laird.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that the You're So Sweet story
Mm.
is probably the most real life creepy story I've ever heard. And I've heard some creepy ones, but
Yeah.
there's just, I mean, it's on a tape recorder, and
Yeah.
yeah, it's just,
I
that's
even
so
considered
strange.
I actually considered recording it onto a separate, playing it and then recording it. It was so horrible that it just didn't.
Yeah.
I literally didn't want anything to do. I didn't know what it would prove anyway. But I wasn't interested in proving anything. I didn't. I'm always just thinking, well, this is a piece of evidence for years later if somebody was stalking us. But it was so nasty that I couldn't
You
even bring
wanted to leave
myself
it
to do it.
behind,
Yeah.
basically. Yeah,
Like
that's
we
understandable.
eventually deleted it off the answering machine. We kept it on for a while, but we eventually just deleted it because it was too nasty. It just wasn't worth it. So
Yeah. Yeah, I can see that, because every time you look at that answering machine, you're
yes.
thinking of, this is what's on there.
Oh, and one last note: we never the whole, like, I heard the voice the one time, and she had allegedly had heard the whispering and the stuff. Never again. We had odd things happen around there, but they were like I told you, physical weird things. We never saw anything else, never heard anything else, and no one ever left any more messages. It kind of died off actually. The last 3 months or so, we left in the middle of the winter, like around Christmas actually, and I would say that last 3 or 4 months and like nothing happened. So it went from almost daily bullshit to like nothing. So I don't know what to say. It could be somebody was really messing with us.
Yeah. Well, the patrons who are watching live are telling me that they really, really enjoyed listening to the stories. So, um,
Great.
yeah, thank you, Laird. Thanks to the patrons who keep me
Yeah.
going, and I don't have to get a job putting widgets together or something, and I can do this. So,
I just like to say that thank you. I really enjoy chatting with you, and
thank you.
also
Thanks.
thanks
Same.
to your Patreons for indulging me. You know, this is the spirit of some campfire tales. I wish we were all sitting around drinking scotch or cocoa or something around a campfire. That'd be fun.
Well, here is my hope for those who listen later, and it is night if you're in the United States, at least most of the United States. But here's my hope: if you're listening later, you're listening to the audio version, and you're driving down a dark two lane road, and you're listening to all these creepy stories. So yeah. Or you're laying in your bed in the dark listening to this, going, "Oh God, what the fuck?"
And your SO is out of town for the weekend. It's just you
That's right.
it's just you and your Chihuahua. Yeah,
Chihuahua.
that'll help.
All right. Yes. Again, thank you, patrons. And uh, thanks, Laird. It was really good talking to you.
Likewise.
And we'll do it again soon.
All right.
And good night, everybody.